Hey guys, tonight we're climbing down through the decks of a Georgian-era pirate sloop to find out what actually happened to the roughly 200 men packed inside her. Not the flag, not the eye patch, not the parrot on the shoulder, but the actual jobs. The quartermaster counting out shares by candlelight. The surgeon with a saw and a stolen chest of medicine. A 10-year-old boy running gunpowder barefoot across a burning deck. In 1721 alone, Admiralty courts from London to Jamaica tried more accused pirates than in any other single year of the entire so-called Golden Age, and nearly every one of those men had a specific job, a specific vote behind it, and a specific price on his head. Welcome to the working pirate ship, the one that actually put to sea, not the one on the poster. Tonight we're going job by job through the roles that kept 200 armed, broke, mostly illiterate men alive on the open Atlantic for months at a stretch, and the truth, almost every single time, turns out stranger than the legend. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe let a fan hum low in the corner of the room, the way wind might move through rigging on a becalmed night. You're warm right now, dry, still on solid ground that isn't moving under you. None of that is going to be true where we're going, so get comfortable and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You didn't ask for this. That's the first thing worth knowing about the job you've just been handed. There's a smell of tar and unwashed wool in the air, the creak of a hull settling under you, and 80-some pairs of eyes turned in your direction on a deck crowded shoulder to shoulder. Someone has just called your name, and a rough forest of raised hands has gone up around you, and it takes you a second to understand what's happening. You've been voted quartermaster. Congratulations, you've just won an election you never campaigned for, on a ship where the only campaign literature was your reputation for staying calm when things went wrong. Here's the thing about that vote. It wasn't a popularity contest in the way a captaincy might have been. Pirate crews of the 1710s and 1720s ran, by and large, as rough democracies, a documented fact confirmed across dozens of Admiralty depositions, not just pirate legend, and the quartermaster's post was arguably more important than the captain's. For the 364 days a year, the ship wasn't in a running gun battle. The captain's word was near absolute only in the chase and in combat. Everywhere else, food, discipline, the division of stolen goods, disputes between crewmen, that authority belonged to you now. A pirate crew had, in effect, split its executive branch in two, centuries before anyone wrote that phrase down, and you were half of it. You'll spend the next few minutes learning what that actually means in practice. And it isn't what you pictured. There's no ceremony beyond the show of hands, no sash, no title carved into the taffrail, just the boatswain shoving a ledger book into your hands, water-stained, half its pages already filled with some dead man's tally marks, and the captain giving you a look that says, more or less good luck. Somewhere below, a cask of salt pork is being counted badly. That's your problem now too. The bad news is that the job comes with almost none of the perks people assume it does. The good news, and it is genuinely good news, is that it comes with something rarer on the 18th century Atlantic than gold, a vote that can, if it comes to it, remove a captain from power. That single fact will matter more than you know before this voyage is over. The vote for quartermaster wasn't just a courtesy extended to keep morale up, it was a load-bearing part of how these crews avoided tearing themselves apart. A merchant ship's crew answered to an owner they'd never met and a captain who could flog them for looking at him wrong with no appeal, no vote, no recourse beyond the King's Navy's own courts if it ever got that far. A pirate crew, for all its violence and desperation, had written articles, a contract of sorts, that every man aboard signed or made his mark on before the anchor was raised, and the quartermaster was the officer whose entire job was making sure that contract was actually honoured day to day. Here's what that meant for you, specifically, starting tonight. You are now the check on the captain's power, the treasurer of a floating criminal enterprise, and the closest thing 80 desperate men had to a judge. Somewhere in the dark below deck, a man was already coming to find you with a complaint. It wouldn't be the last one. Word had gotten around fast, it always did on a ship where privacy meant nothing and boredom meant everything, and by the second hour of your new post, a lean, sun-browned man with a Welsh lilt to his voice found you by the mainmast. His name was Michael Doyle, and 3 months earlier he hadn't chosen this life at all. He'd been the sailmaker aboard a merchant brig out of Bristol, when your ship's previous crew took her as a prize, and rather than kill him or maroon him, they'd done what pirate crews did with skilled men more often than the legends admit. They'd asked him to sign the articles. Some forced men said no and were let go at the next port, no worse for the encounter beyond a bad story. Doyle said yes, not out of bloodlust by his own account, but because a sailmaker's wage on a merchant ship ran a few shillings a month, and a sailmaker's share on a pirate ship, even a small one, could outstrip a decade of honest work in a single lucky season. He wasn't unusual in that calculation. He was in that sense exactly like almost everyone else on the ship, including, if you're honest with yourself, you. Doyle's complaint was small, a dispute over a coat taken from the last prize, who'd claimed it first, and you settled it the way quartermasters settled most things, by asking questions, listening to both men, and making a call that neither of them loved but both of them accepted. Because the alternative to accepting your ruling wasn't appeal. It was a duel, fought ashore, by the Article's own rule that no man could draw a blade in anger aboard the ship itself. You'll want to remember Doyle's name. He's going to matter again before this chapter is through, and not in the way either of you expects tonight. 3 weeks into your first voyage as quartermaster, the ship raised a sail on the horizon, a merchantman, low in the water, clearly loaded, and the chase that followed put every romantic idea you had about boarding a prize to a hard and immediate test. Here's the part nobody tells you. When your ship finally ran the merchantman down and grappled alongside, it wasn't the captain who led the boarding party across. On many pirate ships, that job belonged to you. The captain's authority peaked in the chase itself, where to point the ship, when to fire the warning shot across the bow, but once boarding began, command of the men going over the rail often fell to the quartermaster, because the quartermaster was also, functionally, the ship's ranking combat officer for close work. You went first, or near enough to it, onto a deck full of frightened merchant sailors who had no earthly reason to fight to the death for cargo that belonged to a shipping company back in London, and who mostly didn't. That single fact, that most prizes surrendered without a real fight, is one of the more genuinely surprising things about the record, and it's worth sitting with for a second instead of rushing past it. Violence was the threat that made piracy work, not, in most documented cases, the daily reality of it. A merchant crew paid poorly and treated worse by their own captain had very little reason to bleed for him, and pirate captains understood that and used it, flying black flags specifically to signal surrender now, please, and save everyone the trouble. It's a strange, almost bureaucratic truth sitting underneath all that skull and crossbones theatre. The flag itself was a negotiating tactic before it was ever a threat carried out. By the time you'd finished your first full inventory of that first prize, you, personally with the ledger, because taking stock of a captured ship's cargo before a single crewman touched it was one of the quartermaster's most jealously guarded duties. You understood something about the job that the vote hadn't told you. This wasn't power in the sense of giving orders and being obeyed because you liked the sound of it. It was power in the sense of being trusted by 80 men who trusted almost nothing else in their lives to count honestly. Here's what almost nobody outside the historical record actually knows about that ledger. It wasn't just a tally of loot. Bound into the front of it, on Bartholomew Roberts's ship and several others whose articles survive in one form or another, was a compensation scale, a price list for the human cost of the job, agreed to and signed by every man aboard before he ever fired a shot. According to the articles preserved from Roberts's own crew, a man who lost his right arm in the ship's service could expect 600 pieces of 8 or 6 enslaved people taken in trade, whichever the ship had on hand, a grim but telling detail about what currency meant on a slaving coast in the 1720s. A left arm ran 500, a leg 4 to 500 depending on which one. The loss of an eye or a finger carried a flat 100. It reads on the page almost like an insurance policy, because in every meaningful sense it was one. Centuries before any London company would have dreamed of underwriting a sailor's severed hand, a crew of outlaws had already worked out the actuarial table for themselves, and you were the man who paid the claims. You didn't have to wait long to see it in practice. 4 months out, in a running fight with a well-armed Portuguese trader that refused to strike her colours, a swivel gun burst on the rail near where Michael Doyle stood working a line, and the blast took his left arm below the elbow. The surgeon did what surgeons did, more on him later tonight, and Doyle lived, which by the standards of 18th century field surgery was itself no small thing. What happened after is the part that matters here. Once the fight was done and the prize secured, it fell to you, not the captain, to open the ledger and count out Doyle's 500 pieces of 8 in front of the assembled crew, the article's promise made real in silver on the spot with witnesses. Doyle didn't get a medal or a speech. He got exactly what he'd been promised the day he signed his name, and on a ship built almost entirely out of broken promises from every other institution in his life, a Bristol shipping company included. That plain, unglamorous reliability meant more to him than the money itself. He said as much, later, and you believed him. The dry joke here, if there is one, is that Doyle's payout made him, briefly, one of the best compensated one-armed men in the entire Atlantic world, better off, pound for pound, than most naval veterans who lost limbs in the King's own service and were sent home with a pension that took years to collect, if it ever arrived at all. It's not a joke so much as an uncomfortable fact dressed up as one. The pirate ship, for all its violence, sometimes paid its debts faster than the empire that hanged its crews. Discipline was the other half of your new job, and it was where the theory of pirate democracy met the practical reality of 80 armed, exhausted, frequently drunk men living on top of each other in a hull 60 feet long. The articles on most ships you'd recognise forbade striking a fellow crewman aboard ship, a rule that sounds almost gentle until you understand the reasoning behind it. A knife fight below decks in cramped quarters didn't just risk 2 men. It risked fire near the powder store, it risked the whole crew's nerve in the next engagement, and it risked exactly the kind of chaos that got ships caught by naval patrols. So disputes that couldn't be settled by your ruling were settled the old way, ashore at the next island with pistols or cutlasses, by the 2 men alone, while the rest of the crew watched from a respectful distance and you kept the peace. It was, in its own violent fashion, an early form of due process. Not never fight, but not here, not now, not in a way that endangers everyone else. You'll want to know, because it matters for how the rest of this voyage goes, that your vote, the same vote that put you in this post, could also take the captain out of his. It happened rarely, but it happened, and it happened for real, documented reasons rather than mutiny for its own sake. In 1718, off the coast of what's now the Bahamas, a pirate captain named Charles Vane refused to engage a well-armed French warship his crew believed they could take, and his own men, furious at what they saw as cowardice costing them a rich prize, voted him out that same night. His quartermaster, a young man named John Rackham, better remembered today by his nickname Calico Jack, was elected captain in his place before morning. No trial, no appeal, no admiralty court required. Just a show of hands on a rolling deck in the dark, and a career-ending demotion delivered by the same democratic machinery that had put Vane in charge in the first place. You are, in this moment, standing closer to that machinery than almost anyone else aboard. By the time this voyage nears its end, and it will end, one way or another, sooner than most crews wanted to admit, the quartermaster's post will have cost you something the captain's post never risked in quite the same way. When admiralty courts tried captured pirate crews in Newport and Charleston and Cape Coast Castle, the men most likely to hang weren't always the ones who'd fired the most shots. They were disproportionately the officers, captains, quartermasters, gunners, men the court considered instigators rather than followers, men who couldn't plausibly claim, the way an ordinary hand sometimes could, that they'd been forced aboard and had no say in anything. Forced man was a real legal defence, and it worked often enough that some crews deliberately kept a few genuinely unwilling men aboard as insurance, a fact that says as much about pirate pragmatism as anything else in this whole story. You, as quartermaster, would have almost none of that cover. Your name was in the ledger. Your vote had put men in power and taken them out of it. If this voyage ends in a courtroom instead of quietly at anchor somewhere with your share spent on rum and regret, the record will remember you as one of the men who ran the ship, and courts in this era had very little mercy for the men who ran things. Doyle, for what it's worth, made it out. He took his 500 pieces of 8, left the crew at a friendly port in the Leeward Islands after that voyage's articles expired, and according to the fragments of the record that survive about men like him, which are frustratingly thin, bought into a small fishing boat with another one-armed veteran of the trade, working the coastal waters instead of the deep Atlantic for the rest of a life, history mostly declined to record in detail. It's not a triumphant ending, it's a survivable one, which, on a pirate ship in 1720, was its own kind of victory. You don't get to know, sitting here counting shares by candlelight, which kind of ending you're heading toward. Nobody on this ship does. That uncertainty, more than the gold, is the actual weight of the job you didn't ask for. There's a smell that comes with counting shares below deck by a single tallow candle, hot wax, damp timber, the ever-present tang of bilge water nobody ever fully pumps out, and it's the smell you'll come to associate with the single, most delicate part of the job, making 80 men believe the division was fair. The system itself was, on paper, close to egalitarian by the standards of any wage system operating anywhere in the Atlantic world that year. Under Roberts's articles, and in similar form on many other ships, the captain and quartermaster each drew roughly a share and a half of the total plunder, the gunner and boatswain and other senior men a share and a quarter, and every ordinary hand a full share apiece, the same cut, tailor and topman alike, an arrangement that would have gotten a merchant captain laughed out of his own counting-house. Boys and servants too young or unskilled for full duty might draw a half share, still more than many of them would have seen in a year of honest work ashore. It wasn't communism, it wasn't even quite equality. But it was close enough, consistently enough, that a crew of men with every reason to distrust each other kept choosing to sail together, voyage after voyage, on the strength of a system they'd written themselves and trusted you to enforce to the letter. Enforcing it to the letter meant, in practice, days like this one. 80 men in a rough circle on deck, the ledger open on a barrel head, and you reading out names and sums while every single person present did the arithmetic in their head to make sure their own count matched. Get it wrong, even honestly wrong, even by a few pieces of 8, and you'd hear about it before the candle burned another inch. Get it right, voyage after voyage, and something rarer than gold started to accumulate around your name instead. The thing this whole system actually ran on, which wasn't fear of the captain's authority at all. It was trust in yours. Not every night belonged to the ledger, and not every worry was one you could settle with an honest count. There were nights, lying in a hammock too short for you in a hold too hot to breathe in properly, when the actual weight of the post settled in, not the danger of naval patrols or Spanish guardacostas, which you'd half made peace with the day you signed the articles, but the quieter danger of the men around you. You had the power to depose a captain. That meant, by the same logic, a captain who felt threatened by you had every reason to want you gone first, and captains who felt threatened rarely waited for a vote to settle it. Howell Davis, one of the more successful pirate captains sailing the West African coast in this same era, was lured ashore under a flag of parley by a Portuguese governor at the island of Principe, and shot dead by a hidden ambush in 1719, killed not by his own crew, in his case, but by an enemy who understood that removing a charismatic captain could unravel an entire ship's discipline in an afternoon. You didn't know, lying there in the dark, whether your own danger would come from an enemy governor, a resentful captain, or nothing at all beyond your own tired imagination running loose in the heat. That uncertainty, the low constant hum of it under everything else, was as much a part of the quartermaster's job as the ledger ever was, and nobody had voted you into that part. It simply came bundled with the rest. The quartermaster kept the peace below decks and balanced the books. Above him, in the one arena where his vote briefly went quiet, the chase, the boarding, the roar of the guns, sat a very different kind of authority, one that could make a man a legend in a single afternoon, and a corpse by the next morning. The morning of February the 10th, 1722, off a low, misted stretch of West African coastline near a river the Portuguese called Cape Lopez, a man in a crimson damask waistcoat stood on the quarterdeck of a fast, well-armed pirate ship called the Royal Fortune, directing his crew through the last 30 seconds of his life without knowing it. A gold chain hung around his neck, a cross studded with diamonds, Portuguese, looted from a treasure fleet 2 years earlier, rested against his chest, and 2 loaded pistols swung from a silk sling at his shoulder, because the man believed by every account that survives about him that a pirate captain should look the part right up to the end. He was about to get his wish in the ugliest possible way. A grape-shot volley from a disguised Royal Navy warship tore across the deck, and a single piece of iron caught him in the throat. He was dead, by most accounts, before he hit the planking. This is the story of Bartholomew Roberts, sometimes called Black Bart, arguably the most successful pirate captain of the entire Golden Age, by the only measure that actually mattered to the men who sailed under him, how many ships he took and how many of his crew lived to spend the proceeds. Over roughly 3 years at sea, Roberts and his crews captured somewhere north of 400 vessels, a number so far beyond his more famous contemporaries, Blackbeard included, that it's worth saying twice, 400 ships, and he did it while running one of the strictest, most orderly pirate ships on record, which is not the part of his story that usually makes it onto a flag. He wasn't born to any of this. He came into the world around 1682 in Wales, under the entirely unglamorous name John Roberts, and he spent something like 2 decades as an honest, competent, and by all accounts unremarkable merchant and naval sailor before piracy ever entered the picture. In June of 1719, at nearly 40 years old, elderly by the standards of a trade that chewed through young men fast, he was serving as third mate aboard a slave ship called the Princess, off the West African coast, when his ship was taken as a prize by a pirate captain named Howell Davis. Davis needed a skilled navigator. Roberts reportedly was very good at his job, and so, the same way Michael Doyle would later find himself facing a choice between the merchant trade and the Black Flag, Roberts was offered the articles and, after what Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 account describes as considerable initial reluctance, signed them. That reluctance is worth pausing on, because the record, filtered again through Johnson's often dramatised general history, and worth treating with the same, according to legend caution, we'd give any second-hand quote from this source, has Roberts weighing the decision out loud in terms strikingly close to Michael Doyle's private calculation 2 chapters ago. A life of thin food, low wages, and hard labour in honest service, against a life that was, in the phrase Johnson attributes to him, merry, short, and free. Whether Roberts said exactly those words or Johnson tidied them up for a reading public 40 years later, the underlying arithmetic wasn't invented. It was the same math every forced or half-willing man on this deck had already done for himself. 6 weeks. That's how long Roberts had been a pirate. 6 weeks, by most tellings of the record, when Howell Davis walked into a Portuguese ambush at the island of Príncipe, and was shot dead trying to negotiate with a governor who'd never intended to let him leave alive. The crew needed a new captain immediately, the way any functioning organisation needs its leadership question answered before the next crisis arrives, and they turned, somewhat surprisingly for a man with barely a month and a half of pirate experience, to Roberts. His navigational skill mattered, so, by several accounts, did something harder to quantify, a kind of unshakable, almost severe competence that read, even to hardened criminals, as exactly the steadiness a crew needed from the man standing between them and the bottom of the Atlantic. Here's what happened next, and it happened fast. Within months of taking command, Roberts led his crew across the Atlantic to the coast of Brazil, where in one of the single richest hauls of the entire pirate era, they stumbled onto a Portuguese treasure fleet of 42 ships anchored at the Bay of Bahia, awaiting a naval escort home. Roberts's crew took the most heavily laden vessel in the entire fleet, the flagship itself, in a fast, almost surgical strike, seizing gold, sugar, and most famously, a diamond-encrusted cross that had been intended as a personal gift for the King of Portugal. It's the kind of detail that sounds too good for a history book, and belongs in a novel instead, except the record of the seizure is solid enough that historians treat it as documented fact rather than legend. An actual king, an actual gift, intercepted somewhere over the horizon from its intended recipient by a Welsh former slave shipmate 6 weeks into a new career. The dry joke, if it needs one, writes itself. Somewhere in Lisbon, a royal household spent a very awkward season explaining to His Majesty why his Christmas present never arrived. If Brazil made Roberts rich, Newfoundland made him legendary. In June of 1720, he sailed the Royal Fortune directly into the harbour at St. John's, flying black colours and firing his guns as he came, and the effect on the 22 fishing and merchant vessels anchored there was less a battle than a stampede. Crew after crew, abandoning ship and fleeing into the town rather than face him, until Roberts effectively owned an entire harbour, without losing a man to do it. It's one of the clearest documented illustrations of something worth remembering from the very first chapter tonight. Piracy's real weapon was rarely violence itself. It was reputation, deployed early enough that violence never had to happen at all. Roberts, by 1720, had a reputation that could empty a harbour on sight. But the ship that emptied harbours ran, below decks, closer to a well-drilled naval vessel than to the drunken chaos popular imagination assigns to pirate crews, and the 11 articles Roberts is recorded as having drawn up for his own ship, preserved, again through Johnson's account, and worth the same caution as every other quote from that source, reveal a captain who understood exactly how fragile discipline was on a ship with no jailer, no judge, and no higher authority to appeal to beyond the crew's own vote. Lights and candles were to be extinguished by 8 at night, with any man wanting to keep drinking past that hour required to do so on the open deck, without a light, specifically to reduce fire risk below decks. Gambling for money was forbidden outright. No women were permitted aboard on pain of death for the man who brought one, a rule that speaks less to any particular virtue and more to a captain's cold-eyed read on what jealousy and competition over scarce female company could do to shipboard discipline. Musicians, of whom Roberts kept several aboard for morale, were guaranteed a day of rest on the Sabbath and were otherwise required to play whenever the crew demanded it, arguably the single most enviable and most exhausting job description on the entire ship, and one this script will return to before the night is through. By late 1721, though, the very success that made Roberts a legend had also made him the single highest priority target in the entire Royal Navy's Atlantic operations. A dedicated warship, HMS Swallow, under a determined and unusually capable captain named Challoner Ogle, had been dispatched with the specific mission of hunting Roberts down, and by February of 1722, off Cape Lopez, that hunt finally closed the distance. Roberts's crew, by several accounts, had spent the previous night deep into a captured cask of wine, and were badly hungover and slow to respond when the Swallow, deliberately disguised to look like a harmless merchantman until she was well within range, ran out her gun ports and opened fire. It was the kind of small, human, almost embarrassing failure, not a tactical masterstroke by the enemy, so much as one very bad morning after one very good party, that decided the fate of the most successful pirate captain of his age. Roberts died, according to the most consistent accounts, within seconds of the first devastating broadside, the grape shot catching him in the throat as he stood directing the ship's response, and then his crew did something that tells you almost everything you need to know about what kind of captain he'd actually been to them. Per what several accounts describe as his own standing order, given while he was very much alive and apparently unwilling to leave anything to chance, his men weighted his body and threw it overboard, fully dressed in his finery, weapons and all, before the Swallow could close the distance and claim it. No display in a London courtroom, no head on a pike at some colonial harbour's entrance. Roberts had spent his career denying the Empire an easy victory, and even in death, his crew made sure he denied it one last time. The sea taking the body of the man who'd sailed further and taken more prizes on it than almost anyone else who'd ever tried. What followed was the largest mass trial of accused pirates in the history of the Atlantic world. Roughly 270 of Roberts' surviving crew were captured aboard the Royal Fortune and a second ship sailing with her, and brought to Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast for trial. 52 were hanged. Others, judged less culpable or successful in claiming forced service, the same defence that would have mattered so much to men like the quartermaster from the ship in our first chapter, were sentenced instead to years of indentured labour in the Royal African Company's West African mining operations, a sentence that killed a great many of them almost as surely as the noose would have, just more slowly. Historians looking back on the era often mark Roberts's death, and the mass trial that followed, as close to the effective end of the most active years of the Golden Age of Piracy, not because piracy stopped overnight, but because the machine that hunted it had finally, after 2 decades, caught up with its single most dangerous captain, and the message that's sent to every crew still at sea was impossible to ignore. It's worth slowing down on the Newfoundland raid a moment longer, because the panic it caused wasn't the whole story of that summer, and the part that usually gets left out is the part that says the most about Roberts as a commander rather than as a myth. After emptying St. John's Harbour, Roberts didn't simply loot and burn everything in reach the way the legend tends to compress it. He selected. He held a handful of the captured vessels for his own fleet's use, refitting the best of them with additional guns, and let the rest go. A calculated decision, not mercy for its own sake, because a captain running a fleet of several ships needed hulls he could trust more than he needed the satisfaction of burning every last one to the waterline. One captured vessel, a Bristol galley he liked the lines of, he kept and renamed Royal Fortune. The same name, remarkably, he gave to nearly every flagship he commanded afterward, cycling the title from ship to ship as each one wore out or was replaced, which is either a captain's superstition or simple branding, and honestly may well have been both at once. The record also preserves something colder about that same summer, and it belongs here rather than being smoothed over. Roberts's fleet didn't only take ships. Along stretches of the West African coast the following year, his crews raided slave trading vessels and factories, and the men and women held captive in those ships' holds became, in the ship's own grim accounting, part of the plunder to be divided or sold, the same brutal currency referenced in the compensation articles from our first chapter, where an arm or a leg was priced, in part, in enslaved human beings. It's an ugly, necessary correction to any telling of this story that leans too hard on Roberts as folk hero. He built one of the most orderly, most successful criminal enterprises of the entire Atlantic world, and that enterprise operated unapologetically within the same brutal economy of human trafficking that built the empires he was supposedly defying. The rebellion against wealth and hierarchy that piracy is sometimes romanticized has had very clear limits, and this is one of them. The final chase, when it came, unfolded with an almost cruel sense of narrative timing that no novelist would have needed to invent. HMS Swallow's captain, Challoner Ogle, had been hunting Roberts's fleet along the West African coast for weeks, by February of 1722, and when he finally located two of Roberts's vessels anchored near Cape Lopez, he made a decision that turned out to be the single most consequential tactical choice of the entire campaign. Rather than approach flying his true colours and risk Roberts simply outrunning him, as Roberts had outrun pursuers for 3 straight years, Ogle kept the Swallow disguised as an ordinary merchant vessel for as long as possible, luring the pirate ship Ranger, sailing separately from the Royal Fortune that day, into a chase of its own before revealing his guns and destroying her. Word of the Ranger's capture hadn't yet reached Roberts aboard the Royal Fortune when the Swallow doubled back for the second engagement, meaning Roberts, when he finally spotted the Swallow approaching on the morning of February the 10th, had no way of knowing the ship bearing down on him wasn't the merchant prize it still appeared to be. By the time the disguise dropped, and the Swallow's true gun ports opened, it was already too late for the kind of clean escape Roberts had managed so many times before. His crew, still working through the previous night's captured wine by several accounts, were slow getting the Royal Fortune underway, and the ship that had outrun the Royal Navy across 2 oceans for 3 years found itself for the first time unable to build the distance it needed. What came next has already been told. The grape shot, the throat wound, the body over the side in full pirate regalia before the Swallow could claim her prize as a trophy. It's worth sitting with the contrast for a moment rather than rushing past it, the way the segment formula tonight usually calls for a joke to land here, because there isn't really one to make. A man who had spent 3 years being extraordinarily good at staying alive died, in the end, because of a hangover and 30 seconds of bad luck, and that plain, deflating truth is somehow more unsettling than any amount of dramatic last stand could have been. The trial that followed at Cape Coast Castle later that spring remains, by the numbers alone, the largest single legal proceeding against pirates in the Atlantic world's entire recorded history, and it's worth understanding what that trial actually looked like rather than treating 52 hanged as an abstract statistic. The proceedings ran for roughly a month, presided over by a specially convened Admiralty Court operating under a 1721 Act of Parliament that had specifically streamlined pirate trials to make mass prosecutions like this one possible. The Empire, in other words, had rebuilt its own legal machinery in direct response to men like Roberts, which is its own kind of grim tribute to how seriously his 3-year run had been taken. Men pleaded, argued, produced witnesses to their own forced service where they could find any among the surviving crew willing to vouch for them, and were sorted, case by case, into 3 piles: hanging, transportation to indentured servitude in the mining camps, or, for a smaller number who convinced the court of genuine coercion, acquittal and release. The court's own surviving records describe defendants ranging from hardened veterans of multiple prior voyages to boys barely into their teens who'd been aboard captured merchant ships for only weeks before Roberts's death ended the whole enterprise around them. A reminder that Roberts's crew was never one uniform mass of willing criminals, but the same uneasy mixture of volunteers, opportunists, and unwilling conscripts that made up nearly every pirate ship this whole script keeps returning to. One last detail about Roberts is worth knowing before this chapter closes, because it says something true about how personal this business could get underneath all the statistics. His personal flag, distinct from the generic skull and crossbones most people picture, reportedly showed his own figure standing atop 2 skulls, one labelled with the initials for a Barbadian's head and the other for a Martinican's head, a direct furious reference to the colonial governors of Barbados and Martinique who had specifically outfitted warships to hunt him down after his raids on their shipping. It wasn't abstract branding. It was, by most readings, a threat aimed at two named men personally, flown from the masthead of a ship that had already proven it could make good on threats like that. Piracy on this scale wasn't really a war against the concept of empire. It was, often enough, a running, deeply personal feud between specific captains and the specific colonial officials trying to end their careers, conducted with cannon fire instead of correspondence. Roberts lost that particular feud in the end, the same way every captain in this story eventually loses it, one way or another. For 3 remarkable years, though, he made the Empire itself absorb the cost of chasing him. 400 captured ships at a time, a body count of vessels no other single captain of the era came close to matching before or since. It is worth remembering, too, that none of it, the 400 ships, the harbour emptied at St. John's, the flag with its 2 named skulls, would have meant anything at all without the quieter men who made the ship itself capable of catching its prey in the first place. A captain could be as bold as Roberts, and it would count for nothing against a following wind he never saw coming, a reef he never knew was there, a current that put him a mile from where he thought he stood. That work belonged to somebody else entirely, a man far less likely to have his portrait engraved in a book decades later, and far more essential, day to day, than almost anyone aboard was ever willing to admit out loud. The smell hits you before anything else does. Linseed oil on old paper, the faint metallic tang of a brass instrument that's spent all morning in the sun, and underneath it, always, the salt. You're standing in the great cabin, grand a title for a room the size of a modest closet, with a chart spread in front of you that was stolen from a Spanish prize 3 prizes ago, its coastline half guessed by a cartographer who'd never actually sailed this stretch of water himself. The captain has just told the crew, in front of everyone, that you're the new sailing master. Congratulations. You're now personally responsible for knowing, at every hour of every day, roughly where a wooden box full of criminals sits on an ocean that covers over 60 million square miles and does not care, even slightly, whether you get the answer right. Here's what the job actually involves, and it's worth being honest that most of it is closer to careful guesswork dressed up as science than the confident chart-tapping certainty popular imagination assigns to it. You have, at your disposal, a compass, not always reliable this far from the instrument makers who calibrated it. A backstaff or a Davis quadrant, an instrument that lets you measure the sun's angle above the horizon without staring directly into it and burning out your eyesight, which earlier navigators occasionally did before someone had the sense to invent an instrument that let you look at the sun's shadow instead of the sun itself. A log line, a length of knotted rope paid out over the stern with a wooden float on the end, counted against a small sand glass to estimate the ship's speed in the very unit of measurement that method gave the world, knots, and a lead line, a length of rope with a lump of lead on the end coated in tallow so it would pick up a sample of the seabed when it struck bottom, letting you judge depth and composition well before your own eyes could see danger coming. That's the whole toolkit. No satellite, no radio, and this is the detail that matters most. No reliable way whatsoever to measure longitude, your position east or west, with any real precision. The marine chronometer that would eventually solve that problem was still decades from widespread use aboard ships like yours. You are, in a very real sense, flying half blind across an ocean, using the other half of your senses to compensate as best you can. What you can measure, with reasonable confidence, is latitude, your position north or south, by timing the sun's highest point at local noon and comparing its angle to tables in a nautical almanac. Longitude, though, you're left estimating through dead reckoning, tracking your heading, your speed, and the elapsed time since your last known position, and doing the arithmetic in your head, hour after hour, correcting for currents you can only guess at and winds that shift while you're not looking. Every pirate crew's survival, at bottom, rested on one man doing continuous unglamorous mental math correctly for weeks at a stretch, with no instructor checking his work and no second chance if he got it badly wrong. It's the least cinematic form of heroism this entire story has to offer, and it may also be the most essential. 3 weeks out from Nassau, that theoretical danger stopped being theoretical. The ship needed to make a passage through a stretch of reef-choked water off the Bahamian banks that no charter board described with any accuracy at all, and the only man alive who actually knew the channel by memory happened to be sitting in the hold as a prisoner. His name was Domingos Rodrigues, a Portuguese pilot pressed off a merchant prize taken 2 weeks earlier, specifically because word had reached the captain that Domingos had sailed these waters for a decade and knew the safe channel through the reef the way you knew the back of your own hand. You went down to speak with him yourself, because that conversation belonged to you, and not the captain, persuading a forced man to actually help, rather than quietly steer you onto a reef out of spite, was a navigational skill in its own right, one no instrument could measure. Domingos, as it turned out, had no particular loyalty to the merchant company that had underpaid him for a decade, and a very healthy interest in staying alive. He agreed to guide the ship through, on the deck in daylight, standing beside you at the rail. What followed was 4 hours of the tensest kind of teamwork this ship would see all voyage. Domingos calling depth and heading changes from memory, you relaying them to the helmsman, the leadsman in the chains calling soundings every few minutes to confirm what Domingos already seemed to know before the lead line ever hit bottom. The channel, when you finally cleared it, turned out to run barely 20 feet deeper than the ship's own draft in its narrowest stretch. Room enough, but not room for a single serious mistake. Here's the thing worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Nobody cheered. There was no triumphant cry from the crew, just a long collective exhale, and Domingos still standing at the rail, quietly asking if there was any rum going spare. There was. You made sure of it personally. By the time the ship made for its second careening of that voyage, hauling over on a beach in a hidden bay to scrape the hull clean of barnacles, and the shipworm that could, left unchecked, eat clean through planking and sink a vessel as surely as any cannonball, Domingos had become something closer to a valued crewman than a prisoner, though he'd never signed the articles and everyone aboard, including him, understood the arrangement was temporary. Choosing a careening site was itself a navigational judgment. Shallow enough water to beach the ship safely at high tide, sheltered enough from prevailing winds and passing naval patrols, with fresh water and timber nearby for repairs. Get it wrong, and a crew could find itself trapped, hull half stripped and defenceless, by the very patrol ships it had spent the voyage evading. You picked well. The ship spent 9 days on her side on a quiet beach while the carpenter's crew worked, and nothing worse than sunburn and boredom troubled anyone the entire time. A storm caught the ship 11 days later, well clear of any charted coast, and for 6 solid hours every piece of navigational certainty you'd built over the voyage came apart at once. Dead reckoning depends on knowing your speed and heading with reasonable precision, and a storm strips both away, the ship pitching and yawing too violently for an accurate logline reading, the compass swinging wild, the sun and stars you'd normally check your position against vanished behind a solid ceiling of black cloud. You genuinely did not know, within perhaps 40 or 50 miles in any direction, exactly where the ship stood when the weather finally broke near dawn. What happens next, and how badly that lost margin nearly cost the whole crew everything, belongs to a different part of this story. The surgeon's part, in fact, and the reason his chest of tools mattered as much as your charts ever did. But that's not yet. Domingos left the ship not long after, at a small trading port where the captain, keeping to an unwritten but fairly consistent pattern among crews who'd used forced pilots well, offered him passage ashore along with a modest share of the last prize's takings, not the full portion a signed crewman would have earned, but more silver than a decade of an honest pilot's wages back home would likely have paid him. He took it. Whether he ever piloted another ship, pirate or otherwise, the surviving record doesn't say. What it does preserve, in the handful of Admiralty depositions from men like him who were later questioned about their time aboard pirate vessels, is a recurring, almost formulaic line, repeated by pilot after captured pilot across a dozen different cases, that they had been forced, that they had cooperated only to save their own lives, and that they had left the ship at the very first honest opportunity. Some of those men were telling the exact truth. Some, like Domingos might have, were telling a court exactly what it wanted to hear, having quietly enjoyed a share of pirate gold and every intention of keeping it. Here's a number worth sitting with before this chapter moves on, because it quietly undercuts almost everything the Flag and Cutlass version of this story implies. Across the whole of the Golden Age, more pirates are believed to have died from shipwreck, drowning, and disease than were ever killed in ship-to-ship combat. It's not a controversial claim among historians who've worked through the surviving Admiralty and colonial records. It's closer to a consensus, if a quietly unsettling one. The sailing master's job, in that light, wasn't a supporting role to the captain's glory. It was arguably the single post most directly responsible for whether a crew lived or died on a night-to-night basis, because a cannonball was a threat you could see coming and shoot back at. A reef in the dark, discovered only when the hull was already grinding against it, was not. Keeping the log was a duty that fell to you as much as calculating position did, and it's worth understanding what that actually looked like in practice, hour after hour, because it's the least dramatic part of the job, and also the part every single other decision aboard depended on. Every watch, without exception, you or a mate working under your direction recorded heading, estimated speed from the log line, and any notable event, a sighting, a sounding, a change in the weather, into a bound book that would, over the length of a voyage, become the ship's entire memory of where it had been and how it had gotten there. Lose that book in a storm or a boarding, and a crew could find itself, in an instant, as lost as if none of the previous months of careful navigation had ever happened. More than one prize was taken specifically, in part for its own logbook and charts. Paper, in this line of work, was sometimes worth more by weight than the coin sitting in the same hold. Night navigation brought its own particular quiet and its own particular danger. With no visible coastline to check against, you learned to read the sky the way Domingos had read a reef he couldn't see either, by memory, by feel, by the position of stars whose names most of the crew had never bothered to learn and never needed to. The North Star, held at a known angle above the horizon, gave you a rough check on latitude even without the sun. A cluster of familiar constellations, tracked night after night, told you roughly how much time had passed, and roughly which direction the ship still pointed, even through hours when the compass card, lit by a single dim lantern, was hard to read accurately in a rolling sea. There is a particular, specific kind of loneliness in that job that almost never makes it into the stories. Standing at the rail past midnight, the rest of the crew asleep or drinking below, doing arithmetic in your head against a sky that offers no confirmation, no second opinion, and no comfort beyond your own confidence that you've done the sums correctly. There was, too, a strange intimacy that grew between you and Domingos over those 9 days on the beach during the second careening, one that the ship's articles had no category for and no share allotted to. He talked, in the long idle hours while the carpenter's crew scraped and recalked the hull, about a wife and 2 daughters back in a port on the Portuguese-controlled coast of Brazil, about a decade of piloting merchant ships through exactly the kind of reef-strewn water that had nearly claimed you 3 weeks earlier, about a captain he'd served under for years who'd never once, in all that time, learned his name and simply called him the pilot, the way you might refer to a useful tool rather than a man. He wasn't sentimental about it. He said it the way a person states a plain fact about the weather. But you noticed, and you made a point after that of using his name every single time you addressed him, which cost you nothing and seemed in some small and unspoken way to matter to him more than the eventual silver did. The overlap between your authority and the captain's was never entirely clean, and it's worth being honest about the friction rather than pretending the org chart settled everything on its own. In open pursuit of a prize, the captain called for more sail, called the heading, made the tactical calls about closing distance and angle of approach, but the captain was making those calls using numbers you had produced, current and depth, and the ship's actual capability given her trim and the state of her hull, and a captain who ignored the master's read of the water too many times tended not to keep a functioning ship, or a functioning crew's confidence, for very long. It wasn't quite a check on power the way the quartermaster's vote was. It was closer to the quiet, structural kind of authority that comes from being the only person aboard who actually knows whether the plan the captain just shouted is physically possible, and every captain worth following learned, sooner or later, to listen when you said no. Within a year of signing your own articles as sailing master, you'd learned the particular geography of fear that came with the job, which was not, as you might have guessed before you'd ever held the post, the fear of enemy sails on the horizon. It was the fear of a coastline you'd never charted, approached at night, with a following wind too strong to easily reduce, and a lead line calling depths that were shrinking faster than the arithmetic in your head said they should. That happened twice more before this voyage's end, both times off stretches of the Central American coast, where the available charts, copied and recopied from decades-old Spanish surveys, disagreed with each other by miles. Both times you ordered the ship to heave to and wait for daylight rather than push on through darkness on a guess. And both times, a portion of the crew grumbled about lost hours and a lost head start on a prize that might slip away before morning. Neither time did you change the order. A day's delay had never sunk a ship. A confident guess in the dark, more than once in this trade's history had. The second of those 2 nights, the grumbling nearly turned into something worse. A boatswain's mate named Harker, drunk on captured Madeira and frustrated at another night spent motionless within sight, he was certain of easy plunder just past the point. Argued loudly enough on deck that half the crew heard him accuse you of cowardice dressed up as caution. It's the kind of moment the job rarely prepares you for directly, not the math, which you'd long since mastered, but the simple, human problem of holding a decision steady against a furious half-drunk man in front of an audience that hadn't yet decided whose side to take. You didn't shout him down. You walked him, still protesting, to the rail, and had the leadsman take a sounding right there in front of him. 11 fathoms, shoaling fast on a falling tide, exactly where your chart's uncertain coastline suggested a reef might sit unmarked. You didn't say another word. You didn't need to. Harker went quiet, and by morning, when the light came up and revealed a genuine reef sitting almost precisely where the sounding had warned it would, nobody aboard grumbled about a delay again for the rest of that voyage. Being right, it turns out, was a more durable form of authority than being loud, though it rarely felt that way in the moment. The storm that scattered your bearings and stripped away every certainty the compass and the log line had given you left the ship badly needing something no chart or quadrant could provide. A man below decks with a saw, a needle, and the grim, practiced calm to put broken bodies back together before morning. Before that storm ever rolled in, though, there was a quieter afternoon worth telling, because it's the kind of detail the flag and cutlass version of this story has no room for at all. A powder monkey aboard, a boy no older than 12 who went by Sam and had been aboard barely 2 months, took to following Domingos around the deck during the pilot's last week with the ship, fascinated by the backstaff and the strange, careful way the older man moved it against the sun. Domingos, who had every reason in the world to keep his knowledge to himself and sail off with his silver the moment he got the chance, spent an hour of that last week teaching the boy to find the North Star instead, tracing the 2 pointer stars of the plough with a patient finger against the darkening sky, the same lesson a father might have given a son back in the port he was heading home to. It cost him nothing and gained him nothing. In the strict accounting of shares and articles that governed everything else aboard that ship, he did it anyway. Small kindnesses like that one rarely make it into a trial deposition or an Admiralty record, which is exactly why they're worth saying out loud here. The record remembers the reefs and the wrecks and the hangings in precise, documented detail, and remembers almost nothing at all about a Portuguese pilot teaching a frightened English boy to find north in the dark, for no better reason than that it seemed like the decent thing to do before he went home. You'll see Sam again before this night is through, in a very different job than the one he held that afternoon, and you'll understand, when you do, exactly how much that hour with Domingos ended up mattering. One duty of the post rarely gets mentioned alongside the drama of reefs and storms, and it deserves a line here before this chapter closes, because it killed more sailors across the age of sail than almost anything else on this list, judging, continuously, how many days of fresh water and provisions remained against how many days of open ocean still lay ahead before the next reliable landfall. Get that calculation wrong in either direction, and a crew either wasted a fair wind turning toward land too early, or found itself weeks later rationing brackish water by the cupful with no coastline yet in sight. It was your arithmetic, checked against the quartermaster's count of the casks, that decided when a captain heard the words, "We need to make for shore soon." 4 plain words that could end a promising cruise early, and that no ambitious captain ever wanted to hear, but that every sailing master worth the post learned to say anyway, before the alternative arrived instead. For now, though, the deck belongs to somebody else entirely, the man whose sea chest held not charts and instruments, but knives, saws, and a store of stolen medicine worth more, on some nights, than every ounce of silver in the hold combined. In the last week of May 1718, the harbour at Charleston, South Carolina went completely silent. Not peaceful, silent the way a town goes quiet when every ship trying to enter or leave has just been turned back or seized by a squadron of pirate vessels anchored calmly across the harbour's mouth, flags flying, guns run out, in absolutely no hurry at all. Somewhere between 4 and 9 merchant ships, depending on which account you read, sat trapped inside that blockade over the following days, their crews and passengers held as leverage by a fleet commanded by a man most of the colony already knew, by reputation alone, Edward Teach, better remembered today as Blackbeard. And the ransom he demanded for the hostages, remarkably, wasn't gold, it was medicine. This is the story of a chest, not a man, though the man looms so large over it that it's difficult to separate the two entirely. Blackbeard, by the spring of 1718, had already built one of the most feared reputations of the entire Golden Age, commanding a small fleet built around a captured French slave ship he'd refitted with 40 guns and renamed Queen Anne's Revenge, a ship whose own final chapter this script will return to before the night is through. But reputation, however fearsome, didn't cure fever, didn't set broken bone, and didn't treat the venereal infections that spread through crews confined to close quarters and coastal brothels in roughly equal measure. Blackbeard's fleet, by that spring, was reportedly running dangerously low on medical supplies, and rather than simply raid a harbour for coin the way his reputation suggests, he chose instead to hold an entire colonial capital hostage for a specific, unglamorous, deeply practical demand: a chest of medicine, valued in the surviving colonial correspondence at somewhere around £300 to £400 sterling, a genuinely enormous sum for a single chest of contents that weighed, in total, perhaps as much as a grown man. Governor Robert Johnson's council in Charleston spent several extremely tense days deciding how to respond, with hostages including the son of a sitting council member, Samuel Wragg, held aboard Blackbeard's flagship the entire time as insurance against any attempt to stall or attack. According to the correspondence colonial officials exchanged in the days that followed, a genuinely documented source, unlike much of the Blackbeard legend that gets attached to less reliable accounts, the council ultimately agreed to Blackbeard's terms rather than risk the hostages' lives, and the chest was delivered. The hostages were released unharmed, the blockade lifted, and Blackbeard's fleet sailed north along the coast within days, their medical stores restocked at the expense of an entire colony's dignity. It's worth pausing here to ask the question the whole episode raises and rarely gets a satisfying answer to in most retellings. Why medicine, and why this urgently? The answer sits in what an early 18th century ship's medicine chest actually contained, and what it meant to sail without one. A well-stocked chest of the period typically held mercury compounds, used, with limited and frequently harmful effectiveness, to treat the venereal diseases that spread relentlessly through crews, with regular access to port towns. It held various purgatives and emetics, the blunt instruments of a medical tradition still built largely around the ancient theory of bodily humours, believing illness could be balanced out of a body through vomiting, sweating, or bleeding. It held opium-based preparations, among the only genuinely effective pain relief available anywhere in the period, and bandaging, and the raw materials for wound dressings that, however crude by modern standards, represented the actual difference between a wounded man's survival and his slow, infected death. A ship without a well-stocked chest wasn't merely inconvenienced. It was, in a very real sense, sailing without any meaningful defence at all against the two things statistically more likely to kill its crew than any cannon ever would: disease and untreated injury. Which brings the story to the man, or, more often, the men, since the role rotated through unluckier hands more frequently than almost any other post on a pirate ship, who actually used what was inside that chest. Trained physicians and surgeons were expensive, rare, and, for the vast majority of them, entirely uninterested in volunteering for a career with a strong likelihood of ending on a gallows. Pirate crews solved this labour shortage the same blunt way they solved most labour shortages, by taking surgeons off captured prizes by force, exactly the way Domingo's had been taken for his knowledge of a reef 2 chapters ago. Court records from Admiralty trials across the period contain a recurring, almost formulaic pattern among captured ship surgeons brought up on piracy charges, a claim of forced service, supported wherever possible by testimony from other crewmen willing to confirm the surgeon had never signed the articles willingly, and had been kept aboard specifically, sometimes literally, under lock and threat. It worked as a defence more often for surgeons than for almost any other role aboard, in part because judges and juries found it entirely plausible that a trained professional with a respectable trade waiting for him ashore would need no gold at all to prefer honest practice over piracy. Ordinary seamen, with fewer such prospects on land, found the same defence a much harder sell. What the job actually involved, once a man found himself holding it, willingly or otherwise, was a grim, hands-on trade with almost none of the ceremony modern medicine has trained us to expect. Amputation was the signature procedure of naval and pirate surgery alike, performed with a dedicated bone saw, a tourniquet to slow the bleeding, and, in the absence of any anaesthetic beyond rum and whatever opium the chest still held, a leather strap or a block of wood for the patient to bite down on while several crewmen held him still. The wound, once the limb was removed, was typically sealed by cautery, a red-hot iron, or in some documented cases boiling tar, pressed directly against the raw stump to stop the bleeding and cauterize the wound closed, a treatment that was agonizing in the moment and, by the medical standards of the day, a genuinely effective way to prevent a man from simply bleeding to death on the deck. Michael Doyle, back in our first chapter, went through some version of exactly this procedure the day the swivel gun burst near him, and lived to collect his 500 pieces of 8 specifically because whoever held this post on his ship that day knew the process well enough to keep him alive through it. Blackbeard's fleet, freshly restocked from Charleston's forced generosity, sailed north within the week toward a shallow, difficult stretch of North Carolina coastline near a place called Topsail Inlet, close to the modern town of Beaufort, and what happened to his flagship there, only days after this triumphant ransom, is a story this script will pick up properly 2 chapters from now, because it involves a very different kind of officer entirely, and a decision some historians still argue was no accident at all. Blackbeard himself had less than 6 months left to live after the Charleston blockade. By November of 1718, cornered in a bay off Ocracoke Island by a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard, he died in a brutal close-quarters fight aboard his own sloop, reportedly taking numerous wounds, accounts describing gunshot and blade injuries in the range of 20 or more, before finally going down, and his severed head was hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's vessel, as proof of the kill, sailed back to Virginia as a grim, very literal trophy. It's a hard, ugly contrast to hold up against the Charleston story, and it's worth holding up anyway rather than skipping past it. The same man who blockaded a capital city for medicine to keep his own crew alive was, within half a year, killed and displayed with exactly the theatrical brutality the Empire reserved for pirates. It wanted every other captain on the coast to hear about. Mercy toward his own men, and mercilessness toward him, dispensed by the same world in the same year. What the medicine chest story leaves behind, more than anything else, is a small but genuine correction to the popular image of pirate crews as reckless and indifferent to their own survival. A fleet willing to hold an entire colonial capital hostage, rather than sail without a properly stocked chest of medicine, was a fleet that understood, with total clarity, exactly how much a single competent surgeon and a well-supplied set of instruments were worth more, on the right week, than gold, and worth an enormous risk to secure. It's worth spending a little longer on what a surgeon's actual working week looked like once the chest was full and the ship was back at sea, because amputation, however much it dominates the popular image of the job, was in practice a rare and desperate last resort rather than the daily bread of the post. Far more of a surgeon's time went to ailments that never make it into any pirate legend at all. Scurvy, brought on by weeks or months without fresh fruit or vegetables, which rotted a man's gums, loosened his teeth, and reopened old wounds that had healed years before, treated wherever possible with whatever citrus or fresh greens a landfall could provide, though the precise cause of the disease wouldn't be properly understood by medicine for another 70 years. Dysentery spread relentlessly through a crew, sharing close quarters and questionable drinking water, which a surgeon fought largely with rest, rice, and whatever astringent preparations the chest still held. Rotten teeth, pulled with iron instruments that had no more in common with modern dentistry than a ship's carpenter's chisel does with a surgeon's scalpel, though on more than one vessel it was in practice. The same set of hands and occasionally the same tool doing both jobs, and the constant, unglamorous work of dressing rope burns, splinter wounds, and the crushed fingers and broken bones that came from hauling heavy canvas and rigging in a rolling sea. The ordinary hazards of a physically brutal trade that had nothing at all to do with combat, and everything to do with simply doing the job of sailing a ship every single day. Court records surviving from several early 18th century piracy trials preserve a recurring type of testimony worth quoting the shape of, if not the exact words, because it illustrates just how seriously the forced man defense could be taken when a surgeon was the one making it. Surgeons captured aboard pirate vessels who could produce testimony from former captive merchant crewmen, men who'd been briefly held during a prize-taking and released, and who remembered the surgeon being kept below under guard, or heard him protest the arrangement at the time, stood a genuinely better chance at acquittal than almost any other rank aboard, officers included. It wasn't universal mercy. Plenty of surgeons hanged alongside the crews they'd served, particularly where no such testimony could be found or where a court simply didn't believe the claim. But the pattern is consistent enough across the surviving trial records that historians treat it as a real, functioning distinction in how 18th century Admiralty law thought about coercion and complicity. A distinction that, cynically or not, more than one desperate surgeon reportedly tried to manufacture for himself by loudly protesting his captivity within earshot of exactly the right witnesses, well before any court ever asked him to. There's a particular kind of quiet awe worth sitting with in all of this, the same kind this whole chapter has circled without quite landing on yet. A man with no formal medical school behind him, working by candlelight in a rolling, stinking hold, with tools that would look more at home in a carpenter's kit than a hospital, using a body of medical theory that was, by modern standards, wrong about nearly everything it claimed to understand, and still, against those odds, some meaningful fraction of the men who went under his saw walked away alive, walked away to collect their 500 pieces of 8, walked away to grow old, badly scarred, on a small fishing boat somewhere in the Leeward Islands. It wasn't science. Not in any way we'd recognise the word today. It was nerve, repetition, and a willingness to do an unbearable job quickly and without hesitation, because hesitation, more than almost any other single factor, was what actually killed men on that table. The medicine chest bought at the price of an entire city's dignity mattered, because of what a steady pair of hands could do with the contents once the ransom was paid. And steady hands, it turns out, were rarer and more precious across this whole bloody trade than any amount of stolen Portuguese gold. Open the chest itself on a quiet afternoon with no crisis demanding it, and the smell reaches you before the contents do. Vinegar, tallow, and underneath it something sharper and more medicinal. The sour tang of preserved herbs and the faint metallic note of the instruments themselves, kept wrapped in oiled cloth to hold off the rust that salt air brought to everything aboard within weeks. Bone saws of 2 or 3 different sizes, their teeth fine enough for a careful hand, and coarse enough to work quickly when speed mattered more than precision. A trepanning kit, for the rare and terrifying procedure of relieving pressure on a skull cracked by a fall from the rigging or a blow in battle. A drill-like instrument used to bore directly through bone. A treatment that sounds barbaric, and occasionally, remarkably, saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to swelling the body had no other way to relieve. Forceps, probes, needles and waxed thread for suturing wounds that didn't require amputation, and small glass and ceramic jars, each one labelled in a cramped hand, holding the mercury compounds, the purgatives, and the opium preparations that made up the bulk of what medicine actually meant in this era. It was, taken all together, perhaps the single most valuable object aboard the entire ship, pound for pound, worth more, cask for cask than the rum, and in Blackbeard's calculation off Charleston that spring, worth more than the freedom of an entire harbour's hostages for the better part of a week. Pay for the post reflected some, though not all, of that value. A ship's surgeon typically drew a share and a quarter to a share and a half of the plunder, under most cruise articles, comparable to the boatswain or gunner, a meaningful step above an ordinary hand's single share, though rarely matching the captain or quartermaster's own take. On top of that baseline, several surviving sets of articles specify an additional flat payment owed to the surgeon directly out of the ship's communal stock before any division of the general plunder took place at all. Compensation, in effect, for the chest itself and the specialised skill required to use it, treated as a kind of standing operating cost. The whole crew agreed to cover before anyone touched their own share. It's a strikingly modern instinct dressed up in 18th century language. Pay your specialist first, out of the general fund, before anyone divides what's left, because a crew without a functioning surgeon was a crew one bad storm or one hard-fought prize away from losing men it could never replace at sea. And here, finally, is the part of this chapter that belongs less to the surgeon than to every single man who ever found himself lying beneath his saw, because it's the part that connects this whole story back to the ordinary terror sitting underneath everything else tonight. You're warm right now, and whole, and nothing about your evening requires a leather strap between your teeth or 4 crewmen's hands pressing your shoulders flat against a table that's rolling gently under a ship none of you can stop moving. Somewhere in the documented record of this era, real men lay on tables very much like that one, and lived. not because the medicine of 1718 was good by any standard we'd recognise today, but because someone stood over them with steady hands and did the unbearable thing quickly, and because a chest of stolen mercury and opium and cold iron instruments, ransomed once at the price of an entire city's dignity, was there, within reach, exactly when it was needed. It is, when you sit with it, a strange kind of comfort to know that even in a world this violent and this poorly equipped by modern standards, someone always tried. No pirate crew this script has found record of ever simply let a wounded man die on deck for lack of trying to save him. Whatever the odds, whatever the tools at hand, and that stubborn, unglamorous persistence, more than any cannon or any flag, may be the truest thing this chapter has to say about who these men actually were underneath the reputation. There's a small piece of etymology worth carrying with you before this chapter closes. The kind of detail that turns out to explain something you've probably walked past 100 times without thinking about it. The red and white striped pole outside a modern barbershop traces its ancestry directly back to this same era and this same overlapping trade, when barbers and surgeons were frequently one and the same tradesmen, licensed together under a single guild in England well into the 18th century, and the pole itself is generally understood to represent the two halves of the job at once. White for the bandages, red for the blood. A pirate ship's surgeon, more often than popular memory credits, really had trained first as a barber, or alongside one, in exactly the tradition that Pole still advertises on high streets today, which makes the profession's leap from trimming beards to sawing through bone rather less strange than it first sounds, and the modern barbershop, in its own small, quiet way, one of the last surviving artefacts of a trade this whole chapter has spent its time inside. Blackbeard's stolen chest, in that light, wasn't merely medicine. It was the tools of a barber's trade turned out of necessity into the difference between a crew that could survive its own violence and one that couldn't, and every captain who ever sailed without a full one was gambling with something far more valuable than he usually cared to admit. A ship's company that skimped on its medicine chest to save a few pounds of prize money was, whether its crew understood it in these terms or not, quietly betting every single life aboard against the very same odds a careless captain risked every time he ignored his sailing master's warning about an uncharted reef. Both bets, in the end, were really the same bet, made in different currencies. Patience and preparation, wagered against the raw, indifferent scale of the ocean itself. Not every wound aboard a pirate ship came from a blade or a fall, though. Some came, quite literally, from the ship's own guns, and the men who served them, boys included, faced a set of dangers so routine that most crews simply built the risk into the daily rhythm of the job without a second thought. The same way a modern factory floor might post a warning sign nobody really reads anymore. That's where tonight's story goes next. The smell down here is sulphur first, then hot iron, then something underneath both that you'll come to recognise as fear, sweated out of 30 men crammed shoulder to shoulder in a space with barely enough headroom to stand upright. You're the gunner now, promoted into the post after the last one took a splinter wound that never quite healed right, and your entire world for the length of any engagement has just shrunk down to this. A row of cannon, a magazine of powder 2 decks below sealed off like something holy, and a crew of men who will be completely deaf by nightfall whether the fight goes well or not. Somewhere in the crush of bodies around you, a familiar face catches your eye. A boy grown taller and steadier than you remember, moving fast and low between the guns with a leather cartridge box slung across his narrow chest. It's Sam, the same powder monkey who once stood at the rail learning to find the North Star from a Portuguese pilot who's long since gone home. He's not learning stars tonight. He's running gunpowder, and the job is exactly as dangerous as it sounds. Here's what the gunner's post actually involves, and it's worth being honest that gunner undersells the job considerably. You're less an artillery specialist in the narrow modern sense, and more the officer responsible for an entire category of catastrophic risk that lives permanently below decks, whether or not the guns ever fire. The magazine, the ship's store of gunpowder, sat sealed and carefully managed under your direct authority, because a stray spark in the wrong place didn't just damage a ship, it erased one, crew and all, in a single instant, and naval and pirate history alike record more than one vessel lost exactly that way, not to an enemy's cannon at all, but to its own stored powder finding a spark it should never have reached. Men working near the magazine wore felt slippers rather than hobnailed boots, specifically to avoid the risk of a metal nail striking a spark against stone or iron. No open flame was permitted anywhere near it, ever, under any circumstance. A rule enforced with a seriousness that outstripped almost every other regulation aboard, because every single man on the ship understood, without needing it explained twice, exactly what the alternative looked like. The powder monkeys, boys, almost without exception, chosen specifically for being small enough to move fast through cramped, low-ceilinged spaces that grown men navigated slowly and awkwardly, were the vital, fragile connective tissue between that sealed magazine and the guns themselves. Their job, stripped down to its essentials, was to run pre-measured cartridges of powder from the magazine up to the gun crews as fast as their legs could carry them, over and over, for as long as an engagement lasted, through smoke thick enough to lose sight of the mast above you, and noise loud enough to leave grown men's ears ringing for days. Sam had been doing exactly this since the day 2 chapters ago now, when he'd been fascinated by a backstaff instead. The 2 jobs had nothing to do with each other on paper. In practice, the same qualities that made a boy a good student for a patient pilot: steadiness, attention, a willingness to do a repetitive task with total focus, made him valuable running powder through chaos, and you'd watched him get quietly remarkably good at both. Within your first real engagement as gunner, a running fight against a lightly armed Dutch trader that took nearly 40 minutes to conclude, an eternity by the standards of most prize-taking, which usually ended in surrender within the first 10 or 15, you learned exactly how much of the job was choreography, rather than raw firepower. Loading a single cannon properly took a practiced crew perhaps a minute and a half from one shot to the next. Swabbing the barrel to extinguish any lingering embers from the previous charge, ramming home the powder cartridge, then the shot, then wadding to hold it all in place before you personally checked the aim, adjusting the gun's elevation with a wooden wedge called a quoin, and gave the order to fire. Do that in sequence, correctly, 40 or 50 times across an engagement, in deafening noise, choking smoke, and a rolling deck that never sat still for a moment, and you begin to understand why naval and pirate crews alike valued a well-drilled gun crew as highly as any individual fighter aboard. Skill here wasn't about bravery so much as repetition under pressure, the same unglamorous discipline the sailing master brought to his nightly arithmetic, applied instead to fire and iron. By your 3rd prize taken that season, Sam had become something the ship's articles had no formal title for, but every gun crew recognised instantly. Reliable in a way that mattered more than rank. During a hard-fought chase off a stretch of Caribbean coastline, a swivel gun on the rail, smaller than the ship's main cannon, mounted on a pivot and loaded with scrap iron or small shot, brutally effective at close range against exposed men on an enemy deck, misfired and scorched the arm of the crewman, loading it badly enough that he dropped screaming mid-engagement. It was Sam, not yet 14 and never trained for the gun crew itself, who grabbed the next cartridge from his own box and finished loading the swivel gun himself rather than let the position sit empty during the single worst possible moment for it to go quiet. Nobody had told him to. Nobody had trained him to. He simply understood, in the same steady, attentive way he'd once traced the pointer stars of the plough, with a patient finger, exactly what the moment required, and did it without waiting to be asked twice. Not every engagement ended as cleanly. 3 weeks later, a running battle against a better-armed Spanish guardacosta cost the gun crew dearly. A near miss from an enemy shot sent a shower of splintered oak across the deck, and Sam, caught too close to the blast, lost most of the hearing in his left ear for good, a wound the surgeon could clean and dress but never actually repair, no chest of stolen medicine equal to that particular job. He came out of it alive, which by the plain arithmetic of this trade was its own quiet victory, and under the same compensation articles that had paid out Michael Doyle's 500 pieces of 8 for an arm, he received his own smaller but real payment for the injury. Proof, once again, that the promise written into those articles wasn't decoration. It was a debt the ship actually paid, even to a boy barely old enough to shave, even for a wound that didn't show from across the deck the way a missing limb did. It's worth sitting for a moment with just how much of naval combat in this era, pirate or otherwise, actually came down to noise and terror rather than precision. Cannon of this period were notoriously inaccurate past a few hundred yards, firing rounds shot along a flat, unpredictable trajectory that made hitting a moving target on a rolling sea as much luck as skill, and most historians studying the era conclude that the great majority of prize-takings were decided not by gunnery duels at all, but by the psychological effect of that first close broadside, followed immediately by a boarding party going over the rail, while the enemy crew was still deafened and disoriented. The guns, in other words, existed mostly to open the door. Somebody else always had to walk through it, which is precisely why the quartermaster, back in our first chapter tonight, so often led that boarding party himself, arriving on a deck the gunner's work had already half broken before a single cutlass was drawn. Sam stayed aboard for 2 more voyages after that engagement, eventually earning the informal rank of gunner's mate under your own direction, his hearing never fully returning but his hands never once losing the steadiness that had made him valuable in the first place. You'd like to say his story ends there, cleanly, with a modest fortune and a quiet life ashore the way Domingo's found his. The record of what actually happened to him afterward doesn't survive in enough detail to say for certain, and that uncertainty is, itself, worth sitting with rather than smoothing over with an ending you can't actually verify. Most of the boys who ran powder across decks like this one left no trace in any surviving document at all. Their names, if they had names anyone bothered to record, appearing once in a captain's muster and never again in any archive anyone has since found. What you do know, because you watched it happen with your own eyes, is that for as long as he served, he was steady and brave and quietly kind in exactly the ways that never make it onto a flag or a wanted poster, and that has to be enough tonight, because it's all the record will actually give you. A gun deck full of smoke and noise could win a ship its prize. Before that officer takes over the story, though, there's more of the gun deck worth walking through, because the cannon were never the whole picture of what armed meant aboard a ship like this one, and the variety of weaponry a crew carried says as much about how these fights actually unfolded as the guns themselves do. Alongside the main battery of long guns, typically ranging in size by the weight of shot they fired, anywhere from 4 to perhaps 12 pounds on a mid-sized pirate sloop, nothing close to the heavier armament a full naval ship of the line might carry, sat the swivel guns Sam had learned to load under fire, smaller weapons mounted on the rail itself, quick to reload and devastating at close range against exposed men rather than against another ship's hull. Below that, in terms of both size and range, came the personal armament every crewman carried into a boarding action. Cutlasses, short and heavy enough to hack through rigging as easily as through a man's arm, chosen deliberately over the longer swords favoured by naval officers, because a cutlass worked better in the cramped, chaotic press of bodies that a boarding action actually became. Pistols, often carried in pairs or even greater numbers slung across the chest, on cord or leather baldricks, because a flintlock pistol of this era was a single-shot weapon that took the better part of a minute to reload under calm conditions and considerably longer under fire, a detail that explains why a well-armed pirate boarding a prize might carry 4, 5, or even 6 loaded pistols at once, firing and discarding each one in turn rather than attempting to reload mid-fight. And then there were the grenades, or granados as the period's own spelling usually had it, hollow iron or glass spheres packed with powder, fitted with a crude fuse and thrown by hand onto an enemy's deck, or, in the more harrowing accounts that survive, directly through an open gun port into a crowded space below, where the confined blast did damage entirely disproportionate to the weapon's small size. It was a gunner's job, more often than not, to keep a supply of these prepared and ready, alongside the ship's main powder stores, another category of catastrophic risk added to a job description that already included an entire sealed magazine 2 decks below. The dry joke, if this chapter has room left for one, is that the single most dangerous person aboard a pirate ship during any given week was rarely the captain everyone feared by reputation. It was whoever happened to be walking past the magazine with a lit pipe in his mouth, a habit the articles on most ships banned outright, on pain of punishment severe enough that few men ever risked it twice. Discipline around the magazine extended further than banned flames and felt slippers too, and it's worth understanding just how seriously crews treated the whole arrangement, because the consequences of getting it wrong were absolute, in a way almost nothing else aboard the ship could match. The gunner alone typically held the key, or the equivalent authority, to open the magazine at all, and cartridges were measured and made up in advance during quiet periods at sea, rather than improvised in the heat of an engagement, specifically to reduce the amount of loose powder exposed to open air and spark during the exact moments when a ship was already firing its own guns nearby. It was slow, careful, unglamorous preparation, done during the calm stretches between fights so that the chaos of an actual engagement never had to include measuring powder by hand under fire, you'll notice, if you look closely at how this entire ship actually ran, that almost every post aboard followed this same quiet pattern. The drama belonged to the moment of the fight itself, but the actual survival of the crew was decided in the hours and days of careful, boring preparation that came before it. Work that never made it into any legend because nobody was watching and nothing exciting happened while it was being done. Drilling the gun crews, in those same quiet stretches, took up more of your actual working hours as gunner than combat itself ever did, across the length of a full voyage, a fact that would probably surprise anyone whose picture of pirate life comes mostly from a flag and a cutlass. A crew that had never practiced the loading sequence together, under no pressure at all, tended to fall apart the instant real smoke and real noise arrived, fumbling the rammer, forgetting the swab, doubling a charge in the panic of the moment in a way that could burst a barrel and kill the men standing closest to it. So you drilled them, dry firing without powder, walking the same crew through the same sequence of motions over and over on a calm afternoon with nothing more dangerous in the air than boredom, until the movement stopped requiring thought at all and simply happened. The way Sam's hands had stopped needing instruction the day he grabbed that cartridge box without being told. It's the least romantic image this whole chapter has to offer, grown men and boys, practicing the same handful of motions again and again under a blazing tropical sun, rehearsing for a catastrophe most of them hoped, quietly never actually arrived. And yet it was precisely that unglamorous repetition, more than any individual man's courage, that decided which crews survived their engagements and which ones didn't. There's a contrast worth sitting with here, one this whole night keeps circling back to in different shapes. You're lying somewhere warm and quiet right now, wherever you are, with no gun crew drilling in the next room, no sealed magazine 2 floors below you, holding enough force to end everything in an instant, no boy running powder past your door with his ears already half ruined from the last engagement. That gap between where you are and where this story lives is the entire point of a night like tonight. Not to frighten you, but to let the distance itself become a kind of comfort, the plain, quiet relief of knowing exactly how far you actually are from a gun deck like this one, and exactly how much simpler your own evening is by comparison. Sleep tends to come easier once a mind has been allowed to measure that distance properly, rather than left to wander it in the dark on its own. By the time your voyage as gunner reached its final months, you'd come to measure engagements less by ships taken than by a quieter tally you kept mostly to yourself. How many of your gun crew walked away from each one the same as they'd walked in? It wasn't a number the ship's articles asked you to record, and it wasn't a number anyone else aboard particularly cared about beyond the men directly involved. But you kept it anyway, the way the sailing master kept his log, the way the quartermaster kept his ledger, a private accounting that had nothing to do with silver and everything to do with the simple fact that you'd been given responsibility for other people's lives, boys included, and you meant, as far as it was within your power, to bring as many of them home as the trade would allow. Most gunners, if the fragments of the record are any guide, kept some version of that same private tally, whether or not they ever wrote it down. It's not the kind of detail Admiralty courts asked about at trial, and it's exactly the kind of detail worth remembering anyway. Congratulations in the end on a job that measured its success not in gold taken, but in boys who kept their hearing, kept their limbs, kept their lives, a quieter victory than the one written into the ship's ledger, but the one that mattered most nights, to the man actually keeping the count. Most gunners, it's worth adding, hadn't learned this trade from any pirate captain at all. The skill was too specialised, too technical, to develop from nothing aboard a working ship, and the great majority of men who held the post across the Golden Age had trained first in the Royal Navy or in a merchant fleet's own gun crews, bringing that hard-won discipline with them into an entirely different line of work once circumstance, capture, or simple opportunity carried them into piracy instead. It's one more small crack in the popular image of the pirate crew as a band of untrained rabble waving cutlasses at whatever crossed their path. The gun deck, more than almost any other part of the ship, ran on genuine, portable professional expertise. The same expertise the Empire itself had spent years and considerable expense training into its own sailors, now turned, however uncomfortably for the officials who'd funded that training, against the very shipping lanes it was meant to protect. Keeping that same ship afloat long enough to enjoy it, Through the storms, the shipworm, the slow rot that saltwater worked into every seam of oaken rope aboard, belonged to an entirely different kind of officer, one whose name rarely appears in any captain's log at all, and whose work usually only gets noticed the one time it fails. On the morning of June the 10th, 1718, a heavily armed 40-gun ship ran hard aground on a sandbar at the mouth of a shallow North Carolina inlet, her keel grinding into sand in full view of her own escort vessels, and within the hour a second, smaller ship sent to help pull her free ran aground right alongside her, as if the entire disaster had been rehearsed. The ship was the Queen Anne's Revenge, flagship of the most feared pirate fleet on the Atlantic seaboard that year, and the man standing on her deck watching his own flagship die beneath him was Edward Teach, Blackbeard himself, fresh off the triumph of his Charleston blockade only 2 weeks earlier. What happened in the hours and days that followed remains to this day one of the more genuinely disputed questions in the entire history of Golden Age piracy, and the ship at the centre of it has spent the last 3 centuries teaching historians and archaeologists alike just how much a single vessel's fate can reveal about the men who sailed her. This is the story of that ship, not the man, though Blackbeard's shadow falls over every plank of her. She began her working life not as a pirate vessel at all, but as a French slave ship named La Concorde, built for the brutal, profitable trade in human trafficking that connected West Africa to the plantations of the Americas, carrying captives across the Atlantic under conditions that killed a significant percentage of every voyage's human cargo before it ever reached port. In November of 1717, off the coast of Martinique, Blackbeard's fleet captured her, and rather than sell or abandon the vessel, he made a decision that would define the next 7 months of his career. He kept her, refitted her with additional cannon until she carried something like 40 guns, considerably more firepower than almost any other pirate vessel operating in the Atlantic that year, and renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, a name that has never been fully explained by any surviving document, though historians generally read it as a reference to the recently ended War of the Spanish Succession, fought in the previous Queen's name, rather than any personal grievance of Blackbeard's own. Turning a former slave ship into a proper pirate flagship wasn't a cosmetic job, and it fell, as this kind of structural work always did, to the ship's boatswain and carpenter working in close coordination for weeks at a stretch. Additional gun ports had to be cut into a hull never designed to carry that much armament, each one reinforcing the surrounding timber to withstand both the recoil of firing and the stress of an enemy's return fire. The rigging had to be reworked to handle a heavier, more heavily crewed vessel than she'd carried under her original French flag. Below decks, space that had been built for the horrifying, cramped storage of trafficked human beings had to be reconfigured for a crew that, at its peak, numbered somewhere around 300 men across Blackbeard's combined fleet, one of the largest single pirate crews recorded anywhere in the entire era. None of this work made it into any adventure story. All of it had to happen, correctly, before a single cannon could ever be fired in anger. The boatswain's job, once the ship was properly outfitted, settled into a daily rhythm that had almost nothing to do with combat, and everything to do with the 1,000 small failures that could sink a ship long before any enemy got the chance to. Rigging inspected constantly for chafing and rot, sails mended the moment a tear appeared rather than left to spread, the endless physical labour of raising and trimming canvas overseen and coordinated across a crew of men who needed clear, loud, immediate direction the instant conditions changed. On naval vessels of the period, the boatswain also traditionally carried out corporal punishment when a captain ordered it, wielding the cat-o'-nine-tails himself, a detail worth naming plainly because it makes the contrast with pirate practice sharper rather than softer. Aboard a ship like this one, governed by written articles rather than a captain's unchecked word, that same flogging authority was, on many documented crews, deliberately restricted or removed altogether, replaced by the quartermaster's arbitration and the ashore-only duelling rule described back in this story's first chapter. The boatswain's whistle still called the watches and still drove the daily labour of the ship. It called men to work far more often on a well-run pirate vessel than it ever called them to punishment. The carpenter's work ran in an even quieter, more constant register, and it's worth understanding just how existential a threat his daily job addressed, because it rarely gets the credit the gunner or the surgeon receives in most retellings of this trade. Wooden ships of this era faced a relentless biological enemy that had nothing to do with cannon fire at all: the shipworm, Teredo navalis, a saltwater mollusk that bored directly into submerged hull timber and, left unchecked, could riddle a ship's planking with tunnels until the wood lost most of its structural strength, sometimes within a matter of months in warm tropical water. Left entirely untreated, shipworm damage alone could sink a vessel as surely as any storm. The only real defence available in this period was careening, the same process the sailing master had overseen back in Chapter 3, hauling the ship over onto her side in shallow water, scraping her hull clean of barnacles, weed and worm-riddled wood, and recoating the timber below the waterline with a mixture of tallow, sulphur and other compounds meant to slow the worm's return for as long as possible. It was filthy, exhausting, unglamorous labour, performed with the ship entirely helpless and vulnerable the whole time it lasted, and the carpenter directed nearly all of it personally because he was the one man aboard who could look at a stretch of hull and know, by sight and by feel, exactly how much longer it would hold. It was officially a careening trip that brought Blackbeard's fleet to Topsail Inlet, modern-day Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, in June of 1718, barely 2 weeks after the Charleston blockade had refilled his medicine chest at an entire colony's expense. The inlet was shallow, unfamiliar water, poorly charted by the standards even of that era's already unreliable coastal surveys, and precisely the kind of channel where the sailing master's earlier warnings about untrustworthy charts mattered most. What happened next depends entirely on which account of the record you trust, and it's worth laying out the genuine disagreement rather than pretending historians have settled it, because they haven't. The straightforward version holds that the Queen Anne's Revenge simply ran aground by accident, misjudging the depth of an unfamiliar sandbar the way ships of this era ran aground, with some regularity across the whole Atlantic world. A second, more suspicious reading, one a meaningful number of historians take seriously, rather than dismiss as pure speculation, argues that Blackbeard grounded his own flagship deliberately, using the accident as cover to maroon a portion of his enormous crew on a nearby sandbar, reducing the number of men entitled to a share of the fleet's considerable accumulated plunder, before he sailed off with a smaller, more tightly loyal group aboard a different vessel entirely. The evidence for the deliberate reading isn't conclusive, but it isn't nothing either. Roughly 25 men were left stranded on a small sandy island near the wreck site in the days that followed, while Blackbeard himself, along with a much smaller hand-picked crew, sailed away aboard a sloop with the lion's share of the fleet's treasure, later accepting a royal pardon from the governor of North Carolina, and, for a brief stretch afterward, living something close to a respectable life on land, before the old habits and the old debts pulled him back to sea and, eventually, to that final fight off Ocracoke 5 months later. If the grounding really was deliberate, it would make the Queen Anne's Revenge not simply an unlucky wreck, but a calculated sacrifice, an entire flagship deliberately destroyed to solve a very human, very unglamorous problem. How does a captain divide an enormous fortune among too many men without most of them noticing they've been quietly cut out of the count? The wreck itself sat undisturbed, and largely forgotten for nearly 280 years, until a private research firm called Intersal Incorporated, working with the state of North Carolina, located a promising wreck site near Beaufort Inlet in November of 1996. What followed was years of careful, painstaking archaeological work rather than any single dramatic discovery, divers and researchers slowly recovering and cataloguing an assemblage of cannon, anchors, and thousands of smaller artifacts from the seabed, cross-referencing their size, construction, and placement against the documented specifications of the original French slave ship La Concorde and the refitted armament Blackbeard was known to have added. The identification was never a matter of finding a single confirming label. It was built piece by piece out of an accumulating weight of physical evidence that eventually left researchers confident enough to formally identify the site as the Queen Anne's Revenge, a conclusion the state of North Carolina and the broader archaeological community now treats as effectively settled, even while individual details of the wreck's story, including the question of whether Blackbeard grounded her on purpose, remain open. Thousands of artifacts have been recovered from the site in the decades since, now held and displayed largely through the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort: cannon, navigational instruments, Surgical tools not unlike the ones described 2 chapters ago, personal items belonging to a crew whose individual names, for the most part, the record never bothered to preserve. It is, in its own quiet way, the closest thing this whole story has to a physical monument. Not a statue or a plaque, but the actual salt-eaten timber and iron of a ship that carried 300 men across an ocean, briefly held an entire American city hostage for medicine, and then, whether by accident or by a captain's own cold calculation, was left to the sand and the tide less than a year into her career as the most feared flagship on the coast. There's more worth knowing about what actually happened to the men left behind on that sandbar near Topsail Inlet, because it complicates the story in a useful way rather than letting it settle into a clean villain's calculation. The roughly 24 marooned men weren't simply abandoned to die. Several surviving colonial accounts describe them eventually making their way, whether by their own effort or a returning boat, to the small settlement of Bathtown further up the coast, the same town where Blackbeard himself would soon after accept his royal pardon and settle, at least for a while, into something resembling respectable colonial society. If the grounding really was a deliberate manoeuvre to cut the crew down before dividing the fortune, it was, by the standards of a trade that just as easily left inconvenient men dead on a beach, a comparatively restrained version of betrayal, theft of a share, rather than theft of a life. That distinction mattered enormously to the men living through it, and it's worth not flattening it into simple villainy just because the story makes a cleaner shape that way. The carpenter's toolkit, much like the surgeon's chest 2 chapters back, deserves its own moment of plain physical description, because the work itself was so constant and so essential that it's easy to let the word carpenter pass by without picturing what the job actually demanded hour to hour, and adds, a curved blade axe used for shaping and smoothing timber, with a precision a straight axe couldn't manage, sat alongside augers for boring holes, various planes for finishing surfaces, and reserves of oakum, loose fibres, typically recycled from old rope, hammered into the seams between hull planks and sealed over with hot pitch to keep the ocean where it belonged, on the outside of the hull rather than filling the bilge. Every wooden ship of this era leaked constantly as an ordinary condition of being a wooden ship at all, and one of the carpenter's most unglamorous daily duties was simply monitoring how much water the pumps were clearing each watch, watching for any sudden increase that might signal a seam working loose, or, far worse, shipworm damage finally breaking through somewhere below the waterline where no one could see it happening until it was already a crisis. Careening itself carried its own particular danger, one worth naming plainly rather than treating as a simple maintenance chore, because a ship hauled over onto her side with her guns temporarily useless, and half her crew ashore scraping hull was for the length of that process essentially defenceless. Naval patrols and rival crews alike knew this, and more than one pirate vessel across the historical record was caught and destroyed during exactly this vulnerable window, unable to raise sail or fight back in any meaningful way until the hull work was finished and the ship refloated. Choosing a careening site well, hidden, defensible, far enough from shipping lanes and naval patrol routes to avoid discovery mattered as much to a crew's survival as any single engagement, and it's a decision that, as Chapter 3 already showed you, usually fell jointly to the sailing master and the carpenter working together, weighing navigational safety against the practical demands of the hull work itself. The modern recovery and conservation of the Queen Anne's Revenge's artefacts adds one more layer of quiet wonder to this whole story, and it's worth ending the chapter here rather than rushing past it. Iron objects pulled from nearly 3 centuries of saltwater immersion, cannon, tools, ship's fittings, arrive at the surface in a fragile, heavily corroded state that would crumble to dust within weeks if simply left to dry in open air. Conservators instead use a slow electrolytic process, running a controlled electrical current through the artifact while it sits submerged in a chemical bath, to gradually draw the embedded salt out of the metal over months or even years before the object can be safely stabilized, dried and displayed. It is, in its own way, as painstaking and unglamorous a form of care as anything the ship's own carpenter ever performed on her, while she was still afloat. A slow, patient labour, performed by people who will never meet the men whose tools they're preserving, done simply because the work is worth doing carefully. The same quiet ethic that kept a 300-man crew alive across an ocean nearly 300 years before any of these conservators were born. It's worth closing this chapter with a number that puts the whole disputed question of the grounding into sharper perspective than any single theory can. La Concorde, in her original life as a French slaving vessel, had crossed the Atlantic at least once, already carrying somewhere in the range of 500 enslaved captives, a portion of whom, by the ship's own surviving French records, did not survive the crossing at all, a horror that predates Blackbeard's involvement entirely and belongs to the broader, far larger machinery of the Atlantic slave trade, rather than to piracy specifically. The ship that became the Queen Anne's Revenge, in other words, carried an ugly history into her second career long before any cannon fire or careening beach entered the story, and the wreck now sitting quietly under the sand near Beaufort Inlet is, in that sense, a monument to two overlapping and equally documented chapters of Atlantic history at once, the trafficking that built her and the piracy that renamed and eventually discarded her. Neither chapter cancels the other out. Both are part of the same physical timbers now being drawn, slowly and carefully, out of nearly 3 centuries of silt and salt water. Whether Blackbeard grounded her on purpose, or simply misjudged an unfamiliar sandbar in poorly charted water, the ship's final months tell you something true about every vessel this story has touched so far. None of them were ever as permanent as their reputation suggested. A ship that could hold an entire city hostage for medicine. One month could be sitting abandoned on a sandbar the next. Her crew scattered, her captain already halfway toward a very different, very final ending of his own. The Atlantic didn't much care how fearsome a flag looked flying at the masthead. It only cared whether the hull underneath that flag was sound, and the men whose quiet, unglamorous job it was to keep it that way rarely got their names remembered for the effort. That, in the end, might be the truest thing this chapter has to offer, a reminder that the same ocean capable of carrying a fortune in Portuguese diamonds, one season could just as easily swallow the ship that carried them the next, indifferent to reputation, indifferent to fear, answering only to sound timber, careful caulking, and the patient, thankless labour of a man with an adze in his hand and no interest at all in having his name remembered for it. Archaeologists working the site today will tell you, if you ask them, that the wreck has taught them more about how a working pirate ship was actually built, armed, and maintained than any single surviving written account from the period ever could. 300 years of silence finally giving up its answers not through a dramatic confession, but through the slow, careful cataloguing of rope fibre, cannonbore and rusted iron nail. That, too, is a kind of testimony offered by the ship herself long after every man who sailed her had gone quiet for good. A ship that could be sacrificed so easily, whether by storm or by its own captain's arithmetic, needed one more kind of officer to make her worth sailing at all, the man below decks whose job was never glory, never gold, but simply making sure 200 hungry men had something to eat before any of the rest of this story could happen. Feeding a crew that size, night after night, storm or calm, battle or boredom, turned out to be its own quiet kind of survival work, every bit as essential, in its own unglamorous way, as sound timber and careful caulking ever were. No hull stayed sound, and no crew stayed loyal on an empty stomach, whatever flag flew from the masthead above them, and the next chapter belongs entirely to the man who understood that arithmetic better than almost anyone else aboard. It's a fitting enough note to leave a wrecked, half-buried flagship on. For all the cannon and armour and diamond crosses this story has piled up so far, the thing that actually kept 200 armed men from turning on each other, voyage after voyage, was never the guns at all. It was whether there was still something hot in the pot come evening. The smell reaches you before you are even fully down the companionway ladder. Brine, wood smoke, and under both of them, the faint sourness of biscuit that's been in a barrel too long. This is the galley, if the word galley doesn't oversell a space barely large enough for one man to stand in comfortably, built around a small brick or sand-lined firebox that represents, without exaggeration, one of the single most dangerous fixtures on the entire ship. You're the cook now, and you didn't get the post-through election the way the quartermaster did, and you didn't get it through any particular skill with a ladle either. You got it the way a fair number of pirate ships' cooks actually got their post across the historical record. Because you were injured in an earlier engagement badly enough that climbing rigging or hauling line was no longer realistically within your ability, and the ship's articles, the same ones that promised Michael Doyle 500 pieces of 8 for his arm, also carried an unspoken understanding on many crews that a man who could no longer do a physically demanding job should still have a place aboard, doing work his body could still manage. You lost most of the use of your right leg 2 voyages back, below the knee, to a wound that never healed quite right, and the crew voted you into the galley rather than simply pay you off and let you go. It's worth sitting with that for a second before this chapter gets to the food itself, because it's one of the clearer, quieter pieces of evidence for something this whole night keeps circling back to. A pirate ship, whatever else it was, ran on a set of rules that took genuine care of the men who'd been hurt in its service, in a way almost no other maritime employer of the era bothered to. Here's what you're actually cooking with, and it's worth being honest that cooking is a generous word for most of what happens in this galley on an ordinary day at sea. Salt beef and salt pork, preserved in heavy brine in wooden casks, so aggressively salted that a piece pulled straight from the barrel needed to be soaked for hours, sometimes changed through several changes of water, just to be edible without punishing the whole crew's thirst the next day. Dried peas, boiled down into a thick, filling, entirely unglamorous porridge that made up the bulk of most meals aboard, and hardtack, a dense twice-baked biscuit made from flour, water and salt, engineered specifically to survive months at sea without spoiling, which it accomplished by being nearly indestructible in every sense, including to human teeth. Weevils and other small insects reliably found their way into hardtack barrels no matter how carefully they were sealed, and the standard practice recorded across ships both naval and pirate throughout this entire era was to rap the biscuits sharply against the table or the edge of a plate before eating, knocking the insects loose in the dim lantern light rather than pretending too hard to look for them first. Sailors of the period had a grim, resigned nickname for eating in the dark specifically, so you wouldn't have to watch this process too closely, and you'll understand, the first time you do it yourself, exactly why the trick caught on. Fresh water, kept in wooden casks that grew increasingly foul-tasting the longer a voyage ran, was rationed carefully and supplemented wherever the ship's stores allowed, with rum, not primarily for pleasure, though pleasure was certainly part of it, but because 18th century sailors had learned through hard, repeated experience, long before anyone understood the actual microbiology involved, that watered rum kept sailors healthier over a long voyage than water alone, which grew increasingly contaminated the longer it sat in cask. The result was grog, a mixture of rum and water issued in regular daily rations, and calculating exactly how much of the ship's remaining rum could be safely issued without running the casks dry before the next landfall was, in practice, one of your more delicate ongoing responsibilities. Delicate enough that getting the ratio wrong, in either direction, could produce either a genuinely mutinous crew or a genuinely dehydrated one, and neither outcome reflected well on the man holding the ladle. The firebox itself deserves a moment of its own, because it represented a genuinely serious ongoing danger that every single crewman aboard understood without needing it explained. A wooden ship soaked constantly in her own flammable tar and oakum, carrying a sealed magazine of gunpowder somewhere in her hold, could not simply allow an open cooking fire to burn unsupervised the way a household hearth might. The firebox was built specifically to contain the flame within brick or sand lining, positioned as far as practical from the powder stores, and doused entirely, no exceptions, on any well-run ship the moment rough weather threatened or an engagement began, meaning that on the worst days of any voyage, the very days when a hot meal might have done the crew's morale the most good, you had no fire to cook with at all. Cold salt beef and dry biscuit eaten standing at your station while the ship pitched under a gathering storm or ran down a chase was simply the reality of those days, and no amount of skill in the galley changed that particular arithmetic. Every so often, though, the ship's fortunes handed you something genuinely worth cooking, and those days stood out sharply enough against the ordinary grind of salt pork and biscuit that the whole crew remembered them for weeks afterward. A captured prize occasionally carried livestock aboard, chickens, a pig or two, sometimes a small herd of goats being transported for a colonial market, and taking that livestock as part of the plunder meant for a few glorious days fresh meat and eggs rather than another cask of brine. Landfall at the right island, particularly across the Caribbean, sometimes meant fresh citrus, which crews of this era valued for its taste and its rumoured health benefits, without anyone aboard understanding the precise vitamin deficiency it was actually correcting. Scurvy's real cause wouldn't be properly identified by medical science for another 70 years, though sailors had noticed empirically, again and again, that men who ate fresh fruit stayed healthier on long voyages than men who didn't, and acted on that observation whether or not they understood the reason behind it. By your third month in the galley, you'd learned one of the trade's more unexpectedly reliable sources of fresh meat. And it's a detail that surprises most people hearing this story for the first time. Sea turtles. Green sea turtles, common across Caribbean waters in this period, could be caught relatively easily when they came ashore to nest, and, this is the genuinely remarkable part, could be flipped onto their backs and kept alive on deck for days or even weeks without food or water, a peculiarity of turtle physiology that made them, in effect, the closest thing an 18th century ship had to a self-preserving meat locker. A pirate crew stopping at the right island might take on a dozen or more live turtles, guaranteeing fresh meat for a stretch of the voyage well after the animal was caught. And turtle meat, by numerous surviving accounts from sailors of the period, was considered genuinely good eating rather than a desperate last resort. A rare instance of pirate provisioning actually improving on the ordinary misery of salt pork and biscuit, at least for a while. 3 weeks into a long, becalmed stretch of open Atlantic, no wind, no landfall, and the ship's stores dwindling faster than anyone had planned for, you found yourself in the single hardest part of the job, the part no compensation article ever addressed directly, telling 80 hungry, increasingly irritable men that the salt beef was gone and the peas were nearly finished, with no clear estimate of how many more days stood between the ship and her next resupply. It's a strange kind of authority to hold, being the bearer of bad news that has nothing to do with your own failure and everything to do with wind that simply refuses to blow. And it's worth understanding that this too was part of the job in a way the legend never quite captures, managing not just food, but the crew's mood around its absence, rationing hope in roughly the same careful measure you'd been rationing rum. You weren't the only man in the galley by then. An older crewman everyone aboard called Old Tobias, a nickname rather than any indication of genuine age, though the years and the trade had worn him rougher than most, had lost a leg entirely 2 voyages before you'd even joined this crew, in an engagement fought long before your own injury, and had settled into the cook's post years before you arrived to share it with him. He'd seen becalmed stretches worse than this one, he told you, and the telling helped more than the words themselves probably should have. What he actually did, though, mattered more than what he said. On the worst of those hungry days, when the general ration had shrunk to almost nothing, you noticed him quietly setting aside a slightly larger portion for a young topman who'd been running a fever for days and could barely keep down what little there was, sliding it across without comment, without any expectation of thanks, the same way Domingos had once taught a boy to find the North Star for no reason the ship's articles required of him. It cost Tobias his own already thin ration to do it, and he did it anyway, night after night, until the wind finally returned and the crisis passed. Tobias stayed with the ship for 2 more voyages after that becalmed stretch, cooking through storms and battles and the occasional glorious week of fresh turtle meat, until his health finally gave out, not from any single dramatic injury, but from the slow accumulation of a hard life, the kind of ordinary, undramatic ending that the record almost never bothers to preserve in any detail at all. He was put ashore at a friendly port with his accumulated share, and whatever became of him after that belongs to the same silence that swallows most of these stories once the ship itself sails on without them. What you kept, long after he was gone, was the plain fact of that quiet gesture during the becalmed weeks, proof that even in the leanest, hungriest stretch of the entire voyage, on a ship built out of desperate men making desperate choices, somebody still found a way to be kind and ask for nothing back for it. Feeding 80 hungry men kept a ship's morale intact through the worst stretches of open ocean. Within a year of taking up the ladle yourself, you'd come to understand something about the cook's post that no one had explained when the crew first voted you into it. The job paid less, in the strict accounting of the ship's articles, than almost any other specialised role aboard, typically a single ordinary share rather than the share and a quarter, or share and a half a gunner or boatswain could expect, on the reasoning that the work, however constant, carried far less combat risk than manning a gun or leading a boarding party. You didn't begrudge the arithmetic, not really. A man who could no longer climb rigging with 2 good legs wasn't in much of a position to argue for combat pay, and the crew's willingness to keep you aboard at all, drawing any share whatsoever, was itself more generosity than most injured sailors saw anywhere else in the Atlantic world that year. It's worth remembering, too, that the alternative most maimed sailors faced outside this trade was considerably worse. A naval veteran discharged with a missing leg might wait years for a promised pension that arrived. If it arrived at all, a fraction of what had been promised, while you were drawing a real share of real plunder within weeks of losing the use of yours. Every navy and every merchant fleet operating in this period seems to have produced roughly the same tired joke about its own cooking, and pirate crews were no exception to the pattern, which tells you something comforting, in its own small way, about how consistently unglamorous this particular job was across every flag flying on the Atlantic that century. Sailors called ship's biscuit by half a dozen unflattering nicknames depending on the fleet and the decade, joked openly about weevils as a reliable source of extra protein nobody had asked for, and generally treated the cook's post as a target for good-natured complaint that, tellingly, almost never turned genuinely bitter. You learned to take the ribbing in stride, the same way Tobias had for years before you, because a crew that still had the energy to joke about bad food was, by the plain logic of the trade, a crew that hadn't yet reached the kind of real desperation where joking stopped. The day the jokes went quiet was the day you actually needed to worry. 6 weeks after that long-becalmed stretch finally broke, the ship made landfall at a small, mostly lawless trading settlement where provisions could be restocked without too many questions asked about where the coin paying for them had come from, a common arrangement across several Caribbean and North American ports during this era, where local merchants, officially disapproving of piracy in every public statement, were often quite willing to sell fresh stores privately to a crew flush with prize money, no questions asked beyond whether the silver was genuine. You spent 2 full days ashore overseeing the restocking personally, salt beef and pork repacked into fresh casks, dried peas and flour replenished, a modest supply of citrus purchased specifically against the next long stretch of open water, and not least, enough rum to keep the grog ration steady for months. It was, in its own unglamorous way, among the most important work you did all voyage, more consequential in the long run than any single battle, because a ship that sailed from that port badly provisioned was a ship gambling with slow starvation, regardless of how many prizes she took along the way. There's a particular kind of relief worth naming here, one this whole night keeps returning to in different shapes. You're not hungry right now. Whatever discomfort brought you to this story tonight, it almost certainly isn't the specific grinding weeks-long hunger of a becalmed pirate ship 3 weeks past its last landfall, rationing dried peas by the spoonful and hoping for wind. That gap is worth sitting inside for a moment, not as a guilt trip but as a genuine comfort, the plain physical fact that whatever your evening holds, it very likely does not include watching 80 hungry men wait for you to tell them how much longer the stores will last. There's one more angle to the cook's job worth walking through before this chapter closes, because it touches something this whole night has circled without quite naming outright. How a ship handled illness that had nothing to do with battle wounds or shipwreck at all. The slow, grinding sicknesses that crept through a crowded hull over the length of a long voyage. Dysentery, already mentioned back in the surgeon's chapter, hit the ship's food supply from both directions at once. Contaminated water and poorly preserved meat could cause it in the first place, and a crew already weakened by it needed food gentle enough not to make the condition worse. A genuinely difficult balance to strike using nothing but salt pork, dried peas, and whatever biscuit hadn't yet gone soft with damp. You learned, working alongside Tobias in those early months, to set aside the driest, cleanest portion of whatever stores remained for men working through a bout of it. A small triage of your own that had nothing to do with rank or share size and everything to do with who most needed to keep something down. It wasn't medicine. It was closer to the plain, practical kindness of knowing which loaf of bread to hand to which man, multiplied across 80 different stomachs and 80 different constitutions, all of them your responsibility in a way no ship's article ever spelled out in so many words. The turtles deserve one more mention before the galley story gives way to the next chapter, because the practice reveals something charming and slightly absurd about shipboard life that's easy to miss on a first pass through the record. A dozen live turtles flipped onto their backs on an open deck weren't merely a food source. They became, over the days or weeks before each one was finally butchered, something closer to shipboard pets for a crew starved of any softness in their daily routine. More than one account from sailors of this era describes turtles being fed scraps, occasionally named, and mourned, in a joking but not entirely joking way, when their number finally came up for the pot. It's a strange, small, genuinely tender detail sitting right in the middle of a chapter about salt pork and rationed hunger, and it belongs here precisely because it's the kind of detail the flag and cutlass version of this story has no room for at all. Hardened men, desperate and dangerous by any legal definition of the word, quietly growing fond of a turtle they knew, deep down, they'd eventually have to eat. You never quite got used to that particular contradiction yourself, and you suspect, looking back on it now, that you weren't meant to. A ship like this one asked its crew to hold two entirely opposite truths at once, over and over, for the length of every voyage: that the world was violent and short and worth taking by force, and that small, unnecessary kindnesses still mattered enormously within it, right up until the moment they didn't. Tobias understood that balance better than almost anyone else aboard. You'd like to think most nights that you learned it from him. But no meal, however carefully rationed, mattered at all if the men eating it had no voice in how the ship itself was run, and that, more than any single job this whole night has covered, was the real engine underneath every post you've held so far. Every ledger, every vote, every shared ration owed its real force to a handful of articles a crew of desperate, frightened men had written and signed together, long before any of them ever fired a shot in anger. That document, more than any single captain's reputation, is the real thread connecting every chapter of tonight's story, and it deserves one final closer look before this night is through. Every job this whole night has walked through in the end traces back to the handful of pages that document represented. On the night of April the 26th, 1717, a fierce nor'easter drove a heavily laden pirate galley directly onto a sandbar barely 500 feet off the coast of what's now Wellfleet, Massachusetts, and broke her apart in the surf within minutes, in full view of a shoreline lined with local residents who could do nothing but watch. Of somewhere close to 146 men aboard, only 2 are reliably recorded as having survived. The ship was the wider galley, and her captain, a young man not yet 30 years old named Samuel Bellamy, remembered by history more often than not as Black Sam, had led one of the fastest, most successful, and most short-lived pirate careers of the entire Golden Age, a career that ended, in the end, not in a courtroom or a cannon duel, but in an ordinary New England storm that no reputation on earth could have talked its way past. This is the story of that ship, and of the system that ran her, and of the 140-odd ordinary men who sailed her, and mostly never got their names written down anywhere at all, which makes this last chapter, in a sense, the one that belongs least to any single famous figure and most to every job this whole night has already walked through. The Wider began her working life, like the Queen Anne's Revenge before her, as a slave ship built in London specifically for the Atlantic trafficking trade, and named for the West African port of Ouidah in modern Benin, from which so many trafficked captives were forced aboard vessels exactly like her. Bellamy's crew captured her in February of 1717 off the Bahamas, on her return leg from delivering a cargo of enslaved people to the Caribbean and loading up with sugar, gold dust and coin in exchange, meaning the ship Bellamy took as his flagship was, in the most literal sense, already carrying the profits of one horrific trade before piracy ever touched her at all. Bellamy himself had been at sea only about a year by the time he took the Wider, having started his own pirate career under a captain named Benjamin Hornigold before the crew, dissatisfied with Hornigold's reluctance to attack English shipping, voted him out in favour of Bellamy instead, the same democratic mechanism worth noticing that would remove Charles Vane from his own command a year later and hand the post to Calico Jack Rackham, a pattern this story has now shown you happening on more than one ship in more than one year, which should tell you something about how normal, rather than exceptional, that particular use of the crew's vote actually was. What made Bellamy stand out, even among a genuinely crowded field of successful Golden Age captains, was less his tactical brilliance than his reputation, preserved largely through Captain Johnson's often dramatised 1724 account, and worth exactly the same caution given to every other quote from that source, for a kind of egalitarian, almost philosophical outlook on the whole enterprise. Johnson attributes to him a speech, delivered to a captured merchant captain who'd refused to join Bellamy's crew, arguing that men like himself were free princes with as much right to make war on the whole world as any king who did so, with 100 sail of ships and an army of soldiers behind him, the only difference being that a king did his robbery with the protection of law, and Bellamy did his without it. Whether Bellamy said anything close to those exact words is impossible to confirm. That the underlying sentiment matched how a number of pirate crews of this era genuinely seem to have understood their own enterprise is much better supported by the broader record. What the wreck itself once recovered nearly 270 years later would go on to physically confirm about Bellamy's crew is one of the more quietly remarkable findings in the whole archaeology of Golden Age piracy, and it deserves more attention than the legend usually gives it. The Wider's crew, by most reconstructions drawn from period sources and from the artefacts eventually recovered from the wreck, included a genuinely diverse mix of men, English and other European sailors, several dozen men of African descent believed by researchers to have included both freed and formerly enslaved individuals, some very likely taken from captured slave ships, and, rather than sold onward or left in bondage, brought aboard and enrolled as full crew members under the ship's own articles, entitled to the same vote and the same share as any other man aboard. It's worth being precise about the limits of what the record actually supports here, rather than overstating it. Exact numbers and individual identities remain genuinely uncertain, reconstructed from a combination of period documents, trial testimony from the handful of survivors, and physical evidence from the wreck itself, and historians continue to debate the details. But the broad shape of the finding is well enough supported that the Wider has become, in the decades since her rediscovery, one of the clearest physical illustrations available anywhere of a claim this whole script has made from its very first chapter, that a pirate crew's articles, whatever their limits, and whatever brutal economy they still operated inside, could offer a formerly enslaved man a level of formal, voted, compensated standing that essentially no other institution operating anywhere in the Atlantic world that year was prepared to offer him. It's worth pausing here, before the story moves to the storm itself, to give the ordinary seaman his due, because this whole night has spent 7 chapters now on specialists: the quartermaster, the captain, the master, the surgeon, the gunner, the carpenter, the cook, and it would be a strange kind of dishonesty to close it out without naming plainly that the vast majority of every crew this story has described, Bellamy's included, were none of those things. They were ordinary hands, men who hauled line, stood watch, manned a cutlass in a boarding action, and drew a single full share for it, the same share as the specialist standing beside them, under the same articles, with the same vote. It was, by a wide margin, the single most common job on any pirate ship afloat, and it's the job this whole script has quietly been building toward understanding all along, because every other post described tonight existed to support exactly this, keeping 140 ordinary men fed, healthy, paid fairly, and armed well enough to take the next prize and come home from it. The storm that ended the Wider's short career arrived with almost no warning by the standards of the ship's own log, a sudden, violent nor'easter that overtook the ship while she ran north along the Massachusetts coast, her hold reportedly still loaded with an enormous accumulated fortune from a run of prizes taken earlier that same spring. Bellamy, by the account later given at trial by one of the 2 survivors, made the decision to try to outrun the worst of the storm along the shoreline rather than head further out to open water, a judgment call that a sailing master 5 chapters ago in this same script would recognize immediately as the exact kind of decision his own job existed to get right, and that on this one catastrophic night went wrong. The ship struck a sandbar in heavy surf, her mast came down, and within what surviving accounts describe as a matter of minutes, she broke apart entirely, spilling her crew and her cargo into a freezing, violent sea within sight of a shoreline lined with the local residents who could do nothing but watch bodies wash ashore for days afterward. 2 men survived out of a crew most often numbered around 146, and both of their fates are worth telling plainly, because they're 2 of the only individually documented human stories to survive this entire disaster, with any real detail attached. Thomas Davis, a Welsh carpenter who'd been taken from a captured prize months earlier, much the way Domingos and Michael Doyle were taken in earlier chapters of this story, made it to shore alive and was arrested along with the wreck's other survivor soon after. At his subsequent trial, Davis successfully argued the same forced man defense this script has already described working, sometimes, for surgeons and pilots. Testimony from other captured sailors confirmed he'd been kept aboard against his will and had taken no active role in any of the crew's raids, and he was acquitted, one of the very few men connected to Bellamy's crew to walk away from the whole affair a free man. The second survivor, a man recorded in the trial documents as John Julian, is believed by most researchers to have been of indigenous or mixed Mosquito heritage from the coast of Central America, and his fate afterward is far less clear and considerably darker. Several historians researching the case believe he was not tried alongside Davis at all, likely because the colonial authorities of the period were disinclined to extend the same legal protections to a man of his background, and that he may instead have been sold into slavery in Massachusetts, his further story disappearing from the documented record entirely after that point. It's a hard necessary note to end this particular thread on, and it belongs here rather than being smoothed away. The same colonial legal system capable of hearing out a Welsh carpenter's forced man defence in careful detail treated a second survivor of the identical wreck on the same night in a fundamentally different and much crueler way, and that disparity is as much a genuine piece of this story's record as anything else in it. The wreck itself lay undisturbed under shifting Cape Cod sand for 267 years, its exact location gradually lost even to local memory, until a diver and treasure hunter named Barry Clifford, working with a research team, located and began excavating the site in 1984 after years of searching based on old records and local tradition. What made the discovery historically significant, beyond the sheer volume of coin and artifacts eventually recovered, was a single small object that settled the identification beyond reasonable doubt. The ship's bell, encrusted after nearly 3 centuries underwater but still legible, cast with the words, "The Wider Galley 17-16. It remains to this day the first and for a long time the only fully authenticated pirate shipwreck ever positively identified anywhere in the world, a distinction that matters enormously to historians and archaeologists precisely because so much of what popular culture believes about piracy up to that point had rested entirely on written accounts, court records, and Captain Johnson's often unreliable general history, with no physical ship to check any of it against. The Wider changed that. Suddenly there was hard, physical, undeniable evidence sitting on the ocean floor, cannon and coin and personal effects belonging to men whose names, in some cases, could be cross-checked against the surviving trial records of the handful who'd been captured and tried. Excavation of the site has continued in one form or another for 4 decades since, recovering tens of thousands of individual artifacts, coins from a dozen different nations reflecting the truly international nature of Atlantic trade and piracy alike, weapons, navigational instruments, and the kind of small personal items that turn an abstract historical statistic back into actual human beings. A leather shoe small enough to have belonged to a boy, a cufflink, a pewter spoon worn smooth by years of ordinary use before its owner's very last catastrophic night. Many of these artifacts are now held and displayed at a dedicated museum in Massachusetts, and researchers continue, even now, to study the site for what it can tell them about exactly the kind of question this whole night has been built around. Not who piracy's most famous captains were, but what the actual daily working life of an actual ship, crewed by actual ordinary men, genuinely looked like. What the Wider leaves behind, more than any single treasure or any single name, is confirmation, written not in ink but in coin and bone and rope fibre pulled up out of the Atlantic sand, of nearly everything this script has spent tonight trying to show you, that a pirate ship ran on written articles, a vote, and a genuinely more equal division of risk and reward than almost any other institution of its era offered. That the men who sailed under those articles came from every corner of the Atlantic world, willing and unwilling alike, specialists and ordinary hands alike, drawn together by an arrangement that, whatever its violence and whatever its limits, took its own promises seriously enough to write them down and pay them out. And that the sea, in the end, cared nothing at all for any of it. Not the reputation, not the fortune, not the diamond cross meant for a king, or the medicine chest ransomed from an entire city, caring only, on the one night that actually mattered, whether the men aboard had built something sound enough to survive a storm they never saw coming. It's worth going back and giving Bellamy's rise a little more room, because the speed of it is almost as remarkable as the crash that ended it, and it says something about how quickly fortune could turn in this trade, in both directions. In barely a year at sea, first under Hornigold and then in command himself, Bellamy's crews are credited with capturing somewhere in the range of 50 ships, an extraordinary rate of success that made the Wider, by the time of her loss, one of the most heavily laden pirate vessels ever recorded. Later estimates of the treasure aboard her at the time of the wreck, drawn from period accounts and from the sheer volume of coin recovered by archaeologists since, run into the tens of thousands of pounds sterling, an amount that would have made every single ordinary hand aboard had the ship simply made it safely to port that one night, genuinely wealthy by any standard of the age. That's worth sitting with for a moment. This wasn't a modest haul lost to bad weather. It may well have been one of the largest single concentrations of pirate treasure ever assembled anywhere in the Golden Age, resting for 267 years under less than 30 feet of Atlantic sand, 500 feet from a coastline where people walked their dogs and gathered shellfish for 2.5 centuries without any idea what was sitting just offshore. Local Cape Cod tradition has long attached a romantic legend to Bellamy's final voyage, and it's worth naming it here specifically as legend rather than fact. In keeping with the same caution this whole script is applied to every other disputed claim tonight, the story holds that Bellamy had fallen for a young Cape Cod woman named Maria Hallett before he ever went to sea, and that he was racing north along the coast that April specifically to reach her, treasure in hand, when the storm caught him. It's a genuinely lovely story, and it has essentially no solid documentary support behind it. No contemporary record confirms Hallett existed at all in the specific role local folklore assigns her, and the tale appears to have taken its now familiar shape considerably later, growing in the retelling the way local legends around a genuinely dramatic historical event so often do. That doesn't make it worthless as a story. It makes it exactly what this script has tried to be honest about all night, a legend layered on top of a documented tragedy, worth acknowledging precisely because so many people who visit the Cape Cod coast today have heard some version of it, and deserve to know where the solid ground ends and the folklore begins. There's a thesis this whole script has been quietly building toward across every chapter tonight, and it belongs here, in this final one, stated plainly rather than left implicit. A pirate ship's articles, the same document that put a quartermaster in office and gave him the power to check a captain's authority, that priced Michael Doyle's lost arm at 500 pieces of 8 and Sam's ruined hearing at a smaller but real sum of its own, that guaranteed a surgeon extra pay for the use of his chest, and a musician a day of rest on the Sabbath, that let a formerly enslaved man aboard the Wider draw the identical share and cast the identical vote as any Englishman standing beside him, wasn't a footnote to this whole story. It was the actual engine underneath every single job this night has walked through. Strip away the flag, the legend, and the skull and crossbones theatre, and what's left standing is a genuinely unusual labour arrangement for its era. A floating, armed, entirely illegal enterprise that nonetheless wrote its own constitution, voted on its own leadership, and paid its own debts, however brutal the larger economy it operated inside remained. That contradiction, genuine internal fairness built on top of genuine external violence, is the truest, strangest thing this whole night has had to offer, and it's worth carrying with you rather than resolving it too neatly in either direction. The excavation work at the Wider site continues even now, decades after Clifford's original discovery, using the same slow, careful conservation methods described earlier at the Queen Anne's Revenge: electrolytic baths drawing centuries of salt out of corroded iron, patient cataloguing of coin and bone and rope fibre, a process that will likely continue for years, yet given how much of the wreck site remains to be fully surveyed. Researchers have used the recovered coins alone to trace an extraordinary map of exactly where Bellamy's crew had been trading and raiding. In the months before the wreck, currency from Spain, Portugal, England, and several of their colonial mints all turning up mixed together in the same sand, a small numismatic snapshot of just how genuinely international this whole trade and this whole story actually was. What the wreck cannot give back, no matter how many more decades of careful excavation follow, are the 140-some names lost with her on that one violent April night, men whose jobs this whole script has spent tonight trying to reconstruct, quartermasters and gunners and ordinary hands alike, almost none of whom left behind so much as a signature anyone can still read. That absence is its own kind of monument in the end, sitting quietly under the sand alongside the coin and the cannon, a reminder that for every captain whose name survived in a court record or a Captain Johnson chapter, there were 140 men whose entire working lives, jobs and all, this night has had to reconstruct from fragments, inference, and the patient, ongoing work of people who never met them, simply because someone still thought their story was worth telling carefully. Go back for a moment to the very first image this whole night opened on, a boy running gunpowder barefoot across a burning deck. That was Sam, more or less, before you knew his name. The same boy who once traced the pointer stars of the plough, with a Portuguese pilot's patient finger, who grabbed a smoking swivel gun without being asked, who lost half his hearing and kept going anyway, and whose actual fate, like so many of the 140-some names lost with the Wider, the record simply never bothered to finish telling. That's the truth underneath almost everything you've heard tonight. Not the flag, not the treasure. A ledger balanced by candlelight, a chest of stolen medicine, a chart trusted against an unfamiliar reef, a saved portion of food quietly passed to a sick man who never knew to thank anyone for it. Ordinary jobs done carefully by frightened, greedy, occasionally decent men on a floating wooden world that could kill them a dozen different ways before breakfast. Michael Doyle's 500 pieces of 8 are long spent. Bartholomew Roberts still lies somewhere off Cape Lopez, wherever the current eventually carried him. The Wider's bell sits in a quiet museum case in Massachusetts, and the Queen Anne's Revenge is still giving up her cannon, one careful electrolytic bath at a time, to researchers who will never know most of the names of the men who sailed her. All of it happened. All of it is over now, has been over for 300 years. The debts paid or unpaid, the shares spent or lost to the sea along with everyone who earned them. You're warm, you're dry. The deck under you isn't moving, and it isn't going to start. Whatever job you'd have drawn on a ship like this one, you don't have to do it tonight, or any night after this one. You're safe, you're home. Tonight, that's enough.